Some deals are signed in boardrooms. This one was made in the rain, in a broken-down garage, between a man who had nothing left to lose and a woman who had everything to lose. A CEO walked into a mechanic's life and asked him to lie for her. He said no. Then he looked at her eyes and changed his mind. What followed would cost them both more than either had bargained for. Like and comment your city below so I can see how far this story has traveled. And stay until the end, because this one doesn't end the way you think it will. The night it started, Logan Mercer was lying on his back underneath a 1987 Harley-Davidson Sportster with a cracked oil pan and a customer who'd called 4 times that afternoon asking if it was ready yet. It wasn't ready. It wasn't close to ready. Logan slid out from under the bike, grabbed the rag off his workbench, and wiped his hands without much hope of getting them clean. The garage smelled like motor oil, old rubber, and the faint trace of the microwave burrito he'd eaten for dinner around 6. The overhead light buzzed faintly, one of the fluorescent tubes dying a slow and irritating death. He'd been meaning to replace it for 2 weeks. He hadn't replaced it. Outside, rain hammered the asphalt in sheets. It had started around 4 and showed no signs of stopping. The kind of rain that finds the leaks in your roof and reminds you about them all at once. Logan had a bucket in the back corner of the shop to catch a slow drip near the storage shelves, and he could hear it filling up from where he stood. He checked his phone. 8:47 p.m. Emma was at his sister Patrice's house for the night. That was the arrangement on Tuesdays. Patrice picked her up from school, kept her for dinner, and Logan collected her the next morning before the school run. It was one of the small mercies in his life. Not that he'd admit to needing mercies. He would have described it differently if anyone had asked. He would have said it was just logistics, just scheduling, just making the pieces fit. But the house was quieter on Tuesday nights, and quiet had a way of getting loud inside his head. He was reaching for his water bottle when he heard it. A car pulling into the lot. Headlights swung across the garage bay doors, rain blurred and white, and he heard the engine cut off. He waited. Nobody came in. He went to the door and opened it. She was standing in the rain, not like she'd stepped out of a car and been caught in it, more like she'd been standing there for a minute already, getting soaked, working up to something. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, the kind of outfit that cost more than Logan made in a week, and it was completely destroyed. Her hair was dark and had come partially undone from whatever style it had been in earlier, and it was plastered to her cheek on one side. She had no umbrella. She was holding a phone in one hand and she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at the sign above his door. Mercer's Cycles. Repair and Restoration. "We're closed," Logan said. She looked at him. Her eyes were sharp, dark brown, the kind that seemed like they were always calculating something. Right now they looked tired in a way that went deeper than sleep deprivation. "I know," she said. "I'm not here about a motorcycle." He should have closed the door. That was the logical thing to do. A strange woman, expensive clothes, no umbrella, standing in his parking lot after 9 on a Tuesday night in the rain, none of that added up to anything simple. Instead, he stepped back and held the door open. "Come in out of the rain, at least." She didn't give her name right away. She came inside and stood just past the threshold, dripping on the concrete floor, looking around the shop the way people do when they're trying to steady themselves by focusing on ordinary things. Her eyes moved over the tools on the pegboard, the half-disassembled bikes in the bays, the coffee maker on the workbench that had seen better days. She was clutching her phone now with both hands, and her knuckles were white. Logan pulled a folding chair from against the wall. "You want to sit down?" "No?" She paused. "Yes, sorry." She sat. He leaned against the workbench and waited. "I need something from you," she said finally. "I know how that sounds. I know you don't know me, and I realize I'm showing up out of nowhere at your shop at this hour, and that's—" She stopped, started again. "I saw your name. In a search. You grew up here. You've been here your whole life. You're not connected to any of the... You're not part of that world. That's why it has to be you." Logan looked at her steadily. "What world?" She looked up at him then, and whatever composure she'd been holding on to cracked just slightly at the edges. Not breaking, not collapsing. Just a fissure. A human fault line showing through. "My name is Victoria Hayes," she said. He recognized it. He didn't know much about corporate news or business media, but the name had been in the headlines 6 months back when Hayes Consolidated had gone through a public leadership crisis after the founder died, her father. Logan had caught pieces of it in passing, on his phone while waiting for Emma's dance class to let out, in the background of the TV at Patrice's house. A young woman taking over a multi-billion-dollar company at 29. Everyone had an opinion about whether she'd survive it. "I know who you are," he said. "Then you know the company is under pressure." "Generally speaking," she exhaled slowly. Her hands loosened their grip on the phone, and she set it face down on her knee. "There's a provision in the original company charter. My father wrote it decades ago. It was a different time. It was his vision for the kind of leadership he wanted at the top of the company. The provision states that the controlling majority of shares cannot be transferred to an unmarried heir." She said it flatly, the way you say something you've repeated to lawyers and advisors until the words have lost all feeling. "I've had 3 legal teams look at it. It's valid. It's enforceable. And in 8 weeks at the next scheduled shareholder meeting, the board will review my eligibility for permanent appointment." Logan said nothing. Damian Wolf is the head of the acquisitions division. He's been at the company for 15 years, and he's wanted my father's seat since before I was old enough to have an opinion about it. He has 4 board members aligned with him. If I don't meet the charter provision, they have the votes to force a leadership transition. She met Logan's eyes. To him. The garage was very quiet except for the rain and the slow drip hitting the bucket in the corner. "You need to be engaged," Logan said. "Yes." "To be married before the board meeting." Engaged is sufficient under the provision's language, a formal, documented, public engagement, something I can present to the board as legitimate. She kept her voice even. 6 months. A convincing engagement for long enough to get through the shareholder vote, secure the permanent appointment, and amend the provision so this never becomes a weapon again. After that, a quiet, mutual ending. We go our separate ways. You return to your life. No strings attached. Logan picked up his water bottle and took a long drink. He set it back down. "And what exactly do I get out of this arrangement?" She reached into her blazer and pulled out a folded document. She held it out. He crossed the shop and took it, unfolded it. It was a single page, handwritten figures at the top with a formal legal summary below. He read the top figures twice. His mortgage, which was 3 months behind. His shop loans. The equipment financing and the building lease he'd had to restructure when business dropped off the year before. His ex-wife's legal fees, the ones he'd agreed to cover as part of the divorce settlement, and had been slowly drowning under since. All of it, the exact numbers. Right down to the cents. "How did you get these figures?" he said. "I'm a CEO. I have resources." "That's not an answer." She held his gaze. "A private investigator. I'm sorry. I know I needed to make sure I was approaching someone who would have a genuine reason to consider the offer. Not someone I could pressure with money for the fun of it." He dropped the paper on the workbench. "I need you to leave." "Mr. Mercer, I'm not a prop in somebody's corporate chess game." He heard the edge in his own voice and didn't bother softening it. "I have a kid. I have a life. Whatever you're dealing with, whatever Wolf is doing to you, that's not my problem. I'm sorry about your company. I'm sorry about your father, but the answer is no." He walked to the door and held it open. She stood up from the chair slowly. She picked up her phone. She walked toward the door and stopped. And for a moment she just stood there looking at the rain, and Logan got a look at her face and profile. The set of her jaw, the tightness around her eyes. And he saw something that didn't belong in a corporate negotiation. He saw fear. Not the calculated fear of someone who might lose a job. Something older and more animal than that. Something that looked a lot like the fear of someone who has run out of options and knows exactly what that means. She stepped out into the rain. He watched her walk back toward her car. She had a black SUV parked at the edge of his lot, and the driver was already getting out to open her door. She slowed down about halfway there and stood still for a second, shoulders dropping slightly, and that one gesture, that single second of a person's body giving up the pretense, landed somewhere in Logan's chest like a stone thrown into still water. "Ms. Hayes." She turned around. He was still holding the door open. The rain was blowing in and wetting the concrete at his feet. "Come back inside," he said. "Tell me everything. And I mean everything, not the version you give to lawyers." She talked for an hour. Logan made coffee, the cheap kind, the only kind he had, and she wrapped both hands around the mug without drinking much of it, and she talked. She told him about her father, Richard Hayes, who had built the company from a regional freight brokerage into a diversified holding corporation over 40 years, and who had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of brain cancer 18 months before he died. She told him about the last year of her father's life, how she'd been running the company in practice while Richard held the title, how she'd restructured 3 divisions and doubled the logistics revenue and had done it all while flying back to Connecticut every weekend to sit with her father in a hospital room. She told him about Damian Wolfe. "He was my father's protege," she said. Her voice didn't change much when she said it. She'd had time to make peace with the irony. "My father trusted him, brought him up through the ranks. Damian's good. He's genuinely good at this, which makes him more dangerous than if he were just corrupt. He believes the company should be his. He's built alliances for years. When my father died and I was formally named, Damian spent 2 weeks being completely gracious, and then he started dismantling everything quietly. Changed meeting schedules, pulled 2 major client relationships sideways. He got the charter provision in front of a legal committee, and suddenly it was a conversation. 'And you're not married,' Logan said. 'I've been running a company since I was 26 years old. I work 16-hour days. My last relationship ended 4 years ago because the person said, accurately, that I was never actually present even when I was in the room.' She looked into the mug. 'No, I'm not married. I wasn't supposed to have to be.' 'You've got 8 weeks to find a fiancé.' Publicly announce an engagement, yes, it needs to be visible. Media, board-facing appearances, a convincing story, something that holds up under scrutiny." Logan looked at his coffee. "Why me specifically? And don't tell me it's because I'm not connected to your world. That's a reason to narrow the field. It's not a reason to land on me." She was quiet for a moment. "Because you have a daughter," she said finally. He looked up. "A man with an 8-year-old who he's raising alone, who runs a small business in the same town he grew up in. That story is harder to paint as calculated. It's harder for Damian to frame it as a setup." She met his eyes without flinching. "I'm not pretending that's not strategic. I'm telling you the truth about why you, because I think you're the kind of person who'd find out anyway, and I'd rather you hear it from me." The fluorescent tube buzzed overhead. The bucket caught another drip. "My daughter is not a prop either," Logan said. His voice was quiet and absolutely flat. "I know that. She's 8 years old and she's already been through her parents' marriage falling apart. She doesn't need to get attached to something fake." "I understand. Do you?" The question landed heavier than he'd intended. She didn't look away. "I think," she said carefully, "that I understand it intellectually. I can't claim I understand it the way you do. I don't have children. I'm aware that's a gap." He didn't say anything. "I'm not asking you to involve her," Victoria said. "I'm asking you to be present at professional and public events, dinners, board appearances, a few media-facing moments. Your daughter's life doesn't have to intersect with this at all if you don't want it to. And if someone digs, a reporter, an investigator, Wolf hires, we'd need a story, something credible. How we met, how long—" She stopped. "I know this sounds insane. I know I walked into your garage at 9 o'clock at night and laid all of this on a man I've never met, and I'm asking you to rearrange your life for 6 months. I know what this looks like." "What does it look like?" he said. She almost laughed. It wasn't quite a laugh, more the exhale of someone who would have laughed if things had gone differently. "Desperate," she said. "It looks exactly like what it is." "What?" He didn't say yes that night. He told her he'd think about it, which was the most honest thing he could offer. She gave him a card with a number on it and walked out to her SUV, and he stood in the doorway watching the taillights until they reached the end of the road and turned. Then he went back inside and stood in the middle of his shop for a long time, looking at nothing in particular. The problem was the numbers on that sheet of paper. He could have looked at them the way she'd intended, as a transaction, a straightforward exchange of temporary inconvenience for financial relief. That was the clean version. In the clean version, you did the math, weighed the discomfort, and made a decision. The problem was Logan had been carrying those debts like a low-grade infection for 2 years. The mortgage arrears had started during the divorce, when the legal fees were piling up, and he'd made the decision to cover Janet's costs as part of the settlement because it had felt, at the time, like the right thing to do. Like the decent thing. Like the thing that would make the ending cleaner. It hadn't made anything cleaner. It had just made him poorer. The shop loans were a different story. He'd taken them out to upgrade the equipment 2 years ago, right before a major restoration client had pulled out when the economy went soft. He'd been servicing the debt since then on margins that didn't leave room for broken roof seams or dying fluorescent tubes or any of the other small failures that added up. He'd never told Patrice how close to the edge he was. He hadn't told anyone. He picked up the legal sheet from the workbench and read it again. He picked Emma up the next morning at Patrice's house at 7:45. Emma came out in her school uniform with her backpack on and her hair in 2 uneven braids because she'd insisted on doing it herself, which was a new development, and she was carrying a drawing she'd done the night before that she wanted to show him immediately. "It's a horse," she announced, pushing it at him as she climbed into the passenger seat. "I can see that. Does it look like a horse?" "It looks like a horse who's having a pretty intense day." She studied it critically. "I'm going to fix the legs. The legs are wrong." "The legs look fine." "Dad, the legs are wrong." She tucked the drawing into her backpack with the authority of someone who does not need outside opinions. She buckled her seatbelt. "Are you tired? You look tired." "I'm fine." "You made that face." "What face?" "The one you make when you're thinking about something bad and you don't want to say it." He glanced at her sideways as he pulled out of Patrice's driveway. 8 years old, and she read him better than most adults. That was Emma. She had always been like that, watching everything, filing it away, bringing it out at unexpected moments with an accuracy that was slightly unsettling. "I'm thinking about something," he said. "Not bad, just complicated." "What?" "I'll tell you when I've figured it out." She accepted this with a small nod, the way she had learned to accept his non-answers without fighting them. That particular piece of trust cost him something every time she extended it, because he knew it hadn't come free. It had been built over 2 years of him following through when he said he would, of being there when he said he'd be there, of making the truth feel safe enough to wait for. He dropped her at school and drove back to the shop and called the number on the card. Victoria answered on the second ring. "I have conditions," he said. A pause. "Tell me." "Emma doesn't get used. I mean that. If at any point I feel like she's being positioned as part of your story, this ends." "Agreed?" "I want the debt arrangement in writing, not a handshake, not a promise, a legal document with real teeth. You don't get to walk away at the end and change your mind." "I'll have my attorney draw it up today. I want to see the full picture on Damian Wolf. Everything you know. I'm not walking into this blind." "That's fair." "And I want to understand one more thing before I sign anything." He was sitting in his car in the school drop-off lane with the engine running and a long moment of his life balanced on whatever she said next. "What happens if this goes wrong?" "Not the company. I understand the stakes there. What happens to me? What happens to my kid?" She didn't answer immediately, and that pause was the most honest thing she could have done, because a practiced liar would have answered right away. A practiced liar would have had the reassurance ready. "I don't know," she said. "I think the risk to you is real, and I think anyone who told you otherwise would be lying. Damian has resources, and he has motive to destroy anything that threatens his position. I can't promise you won't take damage from this." Another pause. "What I can promise is that I won't leave you exposed. If he comes after you, we face it together. That's not a legal guarantee, it's just what I'm telling you." Logan sat with that for a moment. "Okay," he said. The first week was almost purely logistical. Victoria sent a car for him on Thursday, which he told the driver to turn around, he'd drive himself, and they met at her offices on the 23rd floor of a glass building downtown. The offices were the kind of place where everything was either chrome or white or a very expensive species of wood, and where people moved through the hallways with the focused urgency of workers in a building where the stakes were always high. Logan showed up in clean jeans and his least worn flannel shirt and was immediately aware of being assessed by every person who looked at him. He let them look. Victoria met him in a conference room. She was in her element here, different from the woman who'd stood in the rain in his parking lot. The fear was tucked away somewhere out of sight, and in its place was this, focused, precise, faintly impatient. She had two people with her, an attorney named Sandra Park and a communications strategist named Brent, who had the slightly performative calm of someone who had managed crises for a living long enough that nothing surprised him. "We need a story," Brent said, opening a laptop. "Origin. How you met. Credible timeline, specific enough to hold up, but not so specific that you can be caught out on details. People remember feelings, not dates. So we want it emotionally textured." Logan looked at him. "You want us to fabricate a relationship history?" "I want us to construct a plausible one, yes." "What's the difference?" Brent glanced at Victoria. Victoria almost smiled. "Logan," she said, "Brent is one of the best communications people in the industry. He's not asking you to be dishonest. He's asking you to be strategic. Those are two ways of saying the same thing." "Can we just—" Brent started. "Here's what I'll do," Logan said, cutting across him pleasantly. "I'll tell you how I'd actually tell someone I met a person and started caring about them. You take that and turn it into whatever you need it to be. I'd rather not know the version you put out." A pause. Sandra, the attorney, looked somewhere between amused and apprehensive. Brent made a face that suggested he'd worked with more difficult clients. "That works," Victoria said. So they did it that way. Logan talked about meeting someone at a bad time in his life, when he was running on fumes and not looking for anything. He talked about what it felt like when someone surprised you, not by being impressive, because impressive was common in his experience, but by being honest when they didn't have to be. He talked about watching someone try to carry too much alone and recognizing that posture because he'd worn it for 2 years. He wasn't talking about Victoria. He was talking about himself. But Brent was typing, and Sandra was taking notes, and Victoria was sitting very still across the table with an unreadable expression on her face. The first public appearance was a benefit gala for a children's hospital foundation, 9 days after Logan signed the agreement. Patrice had to be told something. Logan drove over on a Sunday afternoon while Emma was watching a nature documentary and sat at Patrice's kitchen table and told her a version of the truth that he wasn't entirely proud of. He said he'd met someone. He said it was complicated. He said it was someone from a different world and he wasn't sure where it was going, but he needed her to know. Patrice studied him across the table with the expression she'd been using on him since they were children, which was the expression that meant she wasn't buying it, but she was going to let it go for now. "She good to you?" Patrice said. "It's not like that." "That's not what I asked." He looked at his coffee. "Yeah," he said. "She's decent." "What about Emma?" "Emma doesn't need to be part of it." "Emma notices everything, Logan. You know that." "I know." Patrice was quiet for a moment. "Is this about the money? The debt?" He looked up. "I'm not blind," she said, not unkindly. "I know you've been struggling. It's not just about the money." He considered for a moment. "But partly, yeah. It's partly about the money." She nodded, slowly, the way she nodded when she was filing something away to revisit later. "Okay, you need me to take Emma more. I take Emma more. You tell me what you need." He needed a suit. He did not own a suit. He owned one dress shirt, which he'd last worn to a cousin's wedding 3 years ago, and which no longer fit correctly across the shoulders. Victoria's office called and offered to send someone to take him to a tailor, which he declined, and then he drove to the one decent men's clothing store in the area and bought a charcoal suit off the rack and had it taken in by the dry cleaner on Main Street, who did alterations. The dry cleaner's name was Mrs. Huang. She was 70 years old and had been taking in the waistbands of Logan's work trousers for 3 years. When he came in with the suit, she looked at him for a moment and then said, in the tone of someone who does not waste words, "Somebody important?" "Business thing," he said. She pinned the jacket. "The pants need the seat taken in, too." "Sure." "You got a haircut recently?" He had not. He got a haircut. 10. He picked up Victoria at her building on the night of the gala. She came out of the lobby door and he was standing next to his truck, because he was not going to drive a borrowed car to an event he hadn't agreed to enjoy. And she stopped for half a second when she saw it. She was wearing a dark navy dress, no jewelry except for simple earrings, and she had done something with her hair that made her look like a person rather than a magazine cover, which he appreciated. She looked at the truck. "Is this a statement?" she said. "It's my truck." "Logan, do you want to arrive separately?" She got in the truck. He noticed, as he pulled out into traffic, that she sat with her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead, very controlled, very composed, and her right knee was bouncing at a small, tight frequency that stopped the moment she realized he could see it. "You're nervous," he said. "I'm not." "Your knee?" "I'm not nervous." She paused. "I'm anticipating. It's different." "How is it different?" "Nervous is reactive. This is strategic." He didn't push it. They drove in silence for a while. The city moved past the windows, wet and lit up, still carrying the echo of the week's rain. Logan had made this drive 100 times, but at night, with the city dressed up like this, it felt like someone else's city. "Thank you," Victoria said. He glanced at her. "For tonight, for doing this at all." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I know I don't need to say it. We have a contract, but I wanted to say it anyway." "Okay," he said. "That's it? Okay?" "Would you prefer I say it was no problem? Because it is a problem. It's a fairly significant problem, but it's one I agreed to, so." He shrugged. "Okay." She turned her head and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not offense, something more like curiosity. "You're strange," she said. "I've been told." The gala was at a hotel ballroom that made Logan feel, briefly, like he'd stepped through a door into a world that operated on physics he hadn't been taught. The room was all soft light and round tables, and the specific kind of quiet conversation that happens when everyone in a room is measuring everyone else. Victoria took his arm at the entrance, and the gesture was practiced, professional. Exactly the right amount of contact for a public event, nothing more. He matched her pace. He'd done his homework in the week prior, reading about the board members and executives who would be present, memorizing names and roles and alliances the way he'd memorized engine schematics, which was the only way he knew how to learn something that mattered. He spotted Damian Wolf within the first 4 minutes. The man was in his mid-50s, silver-haired, built with the kind of compact athletic density that comes from expensive gyms and genuine discipline. He had a good handshake face, the kind that came with practiced warmth, and he was working the room with an ease that Logan recognized as the ease of someone who'd been doing it for decades. He hadn't noticed them yet. 2 o'clock, Logan said quietly, near Victoria's ear. "I see him," she said, equally quiet. "Don't look directly. Let him come to us if he comes." "He'll come to us." "Why are you certain?" "Because he wants to see what he's dealing with." She glanced at him sidelong, just briefly. "Smart." They were introduced to 7 people in the first 20 minutes. Logan shook hands, said the right amounts of nothing, and made sure he was positioned comfortably close to Victoria every time a photographer drifted near. It wasn't hard. What was hard was the thing he hadn't anticipated, which was that Victoria was genuinely good at this, not in a hollow performance way. She remembered details, a board member's daughter's school, a partner's recent project, and asked about them with an attention that wasn't quite manufactured. She cared about the things she'd decided to care about, which was different from not caring and pretending, and it showed. He was watching her talk to an older board member named Haskell, watching the way she listened with her whole face when the hand landed on his shoulder. "I don't think we've met." Damian Wolf had the handshake face up close now, offering it to Logan with full wattage. Logan took his hand. Logan Mercer. Damian Wolf. The grip was firm and held a beat too long. "How do you know Victoria?" "Through a mutual friend," Logan said. "Few months back." "What do you do, Logan?" "I run a motorcycle shop." Wolf absorbed this. His expression didn't shift, but something behind his eyes did. A small recalibration, an assessment. "Interesting change of scenery," he said, nodding toward the room. "Victoria wanted company. I wanted to see how the other half lives." Logan smiled, genuine enough to be read as warm, thin enough at the edges to carry a message. "Seems like nice work if you can get it." Wolf studied him for a moment with eyes that were very practiced and very cold underneath the warmth. Indeed it does, he said finally. He smiled and moved away. Victoria appeared at Logan's elbow 30 seconds later. What did he say to you? Asked what I do, felt out the timeline. What did you tell him? That you wanted company. He glanced at her. Was that wrong? She thought about it. No, that was actually right. They were standing close enough that he could smell whatever she was wearing, something understated, clean, not the kind of thing designed to announce itself. He became aware of this in a detached, observational way that he filed away and didn't examine. He's going to check me out, Logan said. I know. Whatever he finds better match the story. It will. She straightened slightly. We're being watched. Can you take my hand? He took her hand. Her fingers were cold. He noticed that. She had warm-seeming eyes and cold hands, and there was something in that small disconnect that felt more real than anything else about the evening. He didn't get home until after midnight. The house was quiet. Emma was still at Patrice's. He stood in the kitchen in his good suit and drank a glass of water and looked at the stack of mail he'd been avoiding on the counter. The arrears notice from the mortgage company was on top, and thought about the legal document that was currently in a folder in his truck, signed and countersigned, making all of that a solvable problem. He thought about Damian Wolf's eyes, cold underneath, warm on top, like ice that had been out in the sun for exactly long enough to become slippery. He thought about Victoria's hand in his, and the specific temperature of her fingers, and the way she'd leaned slightly closer when the photographer came by and then stepped exactly the same distance away when the photographer left, precisely calibrated, always measured. He thought about what Patrice had said. She notices everything. He went to bed and lay awake for a while, listening to the silence of the house, and then he slept. The second week was more complicated. Logan came to understand by the end of it that complicated was going to be the natural state of things for the foreseeable future. The arrangement had variables he hadn't fully accounted for. The debt relief was real and would be real once the 6 months concluded. The legal document made that ironclad. What he hadn't entirely calculated was the texture of the time in between. There were appearances. 3 more in the first 2 weeks. A lunch with 2 board members that Victoria needed him to attend. A company anniversary reception. A brief interview with a business lifestyle magazine where they sat on a couch and answered questions about how they'd met. The magazine interview was the worst of it. The journalist was a woman named Kelly, who was sharper than her smile suggested, and she kept finding angles that neither of them had prepared for. What was your first impression? Kelly asked Logan, pen moving. He thought about a woman standing in the rain, not moving, holding her phone with both hands. That she was tougher than she needed to be, he said. Kelly looked up. Victoria went very still. What do you mean? Kelly said. People who've been handling things alone for a long time develop this armor, I guess. You can see it. The way they hold themselves, the way they answer questions, like they're already managing your reaction before you have it. He shrugged. She does that, still does. Just less than she used to. Kelly was looking at him with the expression of a journalist who had just been given something unexpectedly usable. Victoria was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen on her before. After the interview, outside on the sidewalk, Victoria said, "You didn't have to say that." It's true. It was more than we needed to give her. Probably, he agreed. Did it hurt? She looked away. No, she said. It didn't hurt. And she walked to the waiting car, and he went to his truck, and he drove back to his side of the city with the windows down and the late summer air moving through the cab. The complication that he hadn't anticipated, and that arrived in the 3rd week with no warning, was Emma. He'd been carefully keeping the 2 worlds separate exactly as he'd promised himself. Then his usual Wednesday childcare arrangement fell through. Patrice had a medical appointment that ran long, Emma's school let out at 3, and there was a meeting Victoria needed Logan for at 4:30 that he couldn't reschedule without damaging a carefully arranged board optic. He picked Emma up from school. He had 40 minutes. He called Victoria on the way. I have Emma with me. I can't leave her in the car and I don't have time to drop her. Either I bring her up to the office for 20 minutes and she sits quietly with a book, or you reschedule the meeting. A pause. Bring her. She can sit in the reception area with Sarah. He wasn't sure about this. He knew he wasn't sure about it. But the 40 minutes were already running, and he drove downtown and took Emma up in the elevator, and she stood in the elevator looking at her reflection in the mirrored doors with the mild fascination she brought to all new environments. "Whose office is this?" Emma said. "Someone I know." "From work?" "Something like that." "You don't do office work." "Emma, for 20 minutes, can you just be quiet and look at a book?" She looked at him in the mirror. "You made the face again." Sarah, the receptionist, was great with kids, produced a coloring book from somewhere and a small box of colored pencils, sat Emma down at a low table in the waiting area, and had her occupied in 3 minutes. Logan watched this happen and felt the particular relief of a parent watching a potential disaster be averted by someone more competent. He went to the conference room. Victoria was already there with 2 board members, a man named Patterson, who was a swing vote, and a woman named Corinne Liu, who was aligned with Victoria but needed visible reassurance. Logan sat down and they had the meeting, which was about Q3 projections and a proposed restructuring in the European division, and had absolutely nothing to do with the charter provision or the engagement. Logan listened, asked 2 questions that were specific enough to show genuine engagement, and let Victoria lead, which was how it should be. 35 minutes later, he came out to collect Emma. She wasn't at the low table. He stopped. Then he saw her. She had migrated down the hallway to the open door of Victoria's office, and she was standing in the doorway looking in with the particular stillness of a child who has found something worth examining. Logan crossed the hall in about 4 strides. Victoria was at her desk, leaning back slightly, and Emma was in the doorway with her coloring book under her arm, and they were in the middle of an apparent conversation. "I was going to make the sky purple, but then I thought maybe that's wrong," Emma was saying. "Why would purple be wrong?" Victoria said. "Because skies aren't purple." "They can be, at the right time. Just before a storm comes and the light does a specific thing, the sky gets this color that's between purple and gray, and the closest thing to it in a coloring box is probably that one." She pointed. "The violet one." Emma looked down at the box in her arms. She found the violet one and examined it. "Really? Really? I used to drive from the city out to see my dad on weekends, and sometimes I'd hit the timing just right and it would do that. It only lasts about 3 minutes." Emma thought about this seriously. Then she looked up at the woman behind the desk and said, with the directness she applied to most things, "Are you Logan's girlfriend?" The silence that followed was not uncomfortable so much as very carefully occupied. "We're friends," Victoria said. "Very good friends." Emma nodded with the expression of someone who has accepted an answer they're going to revisit later. "Your office is really clean," she said. "I know. I should probably have more things on the desk. It's a little cold." "You could put a plant." "I've killed every plant I've ever had." Emma's face shifted into the profound sympathy of a child who has never had to be responsible for a plant but understands this to be a serious failure. "You have to talk to them," she said. "That's what my teacher says." "I'll try that." Logan was standing in the doorway behind Emma. Victoria looked up at him over Emma's head, and something in her expression, something small and unguarded that didn't belong in a business negotiation or a media appearance or a shareholder meeting, landed with a weight he wasn't ready for. "Emma," he said, "let's go. Get your stuff." Emma went to collect her coloring book from the low table. Logan stayed in the doorway for a moment. "She got past Sarah?" he said. "Sarah was getting coffee. It's fine." Victoria picked up her pen and looked down at her papers. "She's remarkable." He didn't answer that. "Logan?" She said it without looking up. "I know the rules. I haven't forgotten them." "I know you haven't." "Then why do you look like that?" "Like what?" She looked up. "Like you're trying to decide whether I'm trustworthy." He held her gaze for a second. "I'm always trying to decide that," he said, "about everyone." He picked up his jacket from the rack by the door. "I'll see you Thursday." He drove home with Emma in the passenger seat, her coloring book in her lap, the violet pencil held loosely in her hand. "She's nice," Emma said. She said skies can be purple." "She's right." Emma looked out the window. The evening was doing the thing where the light flattened out before sunset, golden and very still. "Dad?" she said. "Yeah? Are you going to be okay?" He glanced at her. 8 years old, braids slightly looser than this morning, watching him with those eyes that caught everything. "I'm working on it," he said. She seemed to find this satisfactory. She opened her coloring book to the sky picture and picked up the violet pencil, and the car filled with the small sound of her coloring as they drove home through the almost purple light. The Thursday meeting was at a rooftop restaurant that catered to the kind of people who needed a reservation 3 weeks out and still had to know somebody. Victoria had chosen it deliberately. 2 board members would be dining there with their spouses, and being seen was the point. Logan wore the charcoal suit again. He'd had it dry cleaned after the gala, and it came back smelling faintly of chemicals and fitting slightly better than before, as if the cleaning process had finished what the tailor had started. He picked up Victoria from her building again. She was waiting in the lobby this time rather than outside, and she came through the glass doors with a dark red dress and a look on her face that said the day had been long and difficult, and she was not going to discuss it. He held the truck door open. She got in without comment about the truck, which he noticed, and they drove to the restaurant mostly in silence. "Patterson is bringing his wife, Carol," Victoria said somewhere near the 3rd stoplight. "She's sharp and she asks personal questions. Don't be charmed into giving her more than we need." "I'm not that easily charmed. Everyone is charmed by Carol Patterson. That's her specific skill set, and she's been deploying it for 40 years. I'll keep that in mind. Also, Corinne Liu may be there. If she is, let me handle her. She's on our side, but she needs to feel like she arrived there independently." Logan glanced at her. "You run through every conversation before it happens?" "It's how I manage outcomes." "Does it work?" She thought about that with more genuine consideration than he'd expected. "Not always," she said. "Sometimes people surprise you." "Is that good or bad when it happens?" She looked out the window. "Depends on the surprise." The restaurant was on the 28th floor of a building that was mostly glass, and the city spread out below the terrace railing like something from a movie that had been shot with an expensive lens. Logan stood at the railing for a moment before they went inside and looked at it. He'd lived 20 minutes from this building his whole life and had never been up here. That was a particular kind of fact about a city, that it contained entire floors of experience that most of its residents would never stand on. Victoria appeared beside him. "We should go in." "1 second." He stayed at the railing. The air up here was cleaner, or felt cleaner. "You come to places like this a lot. It's part of the job." "Does it still do anything for you? The view?" She was quiet for a moment, and he could tell she was actually considering the question instead of deflecting it. "Less than it used to," she said finally. "When I first started attending these things, I'd find a window at every event and stand at it for a few minutes, just to feel like the work was connected to something real. And now? Now I mostly see the calendar item." He looked at her. She was looking at the city, and the light from below was catching the angles of her face, and she looked tired in a way that she wouldn't have shown to anyone inside that restaurant. "That's sad," he said. "Not cruel, just honest." "I know," she said, and then she straightened and turned toward the door. "Come on." Carol Patterson was exactly as advertised. She was a woman in her late 60s who wore her white hair in a precise cut and asked questions about Logan's shop with the warm, steady curiosity of someone who actually wanted to know the answers, which was the most disarming possible approach. Logan found himself talking about the 1965 Triumph Bonneville he'd spent 4 months restoring last year, the way the original chrome had come back to life under the polishing compound. And Carol was nodding with what appeared to be genuine interest. And he caught himself and pulled back, and Carol smiled at him in a way that said she knew exactly what had just happened. "Victoria's told us very little about you," Carol said. "That sounds like Victoria." "It does, doesn't it?" Carol turned her glass in a small circle on the tablecloth. "She's always been private. Even as a girl, Richard used to bring her to company events, and she'd sit and watch everything and never say much. And you'd think she was just quiet, until you realized she was going to remember every person in that room and everything they said." Logan said nothing. "Her father adored her," Carol said. "It wasn't casual. It was the kind of statement that carries a question inside it." "She doesn't talk about him much," Logan said. "No, she wouldn't." Carol studied him with mild, bright eyes. "Do you think she's happy?" The question arrived without warning and with the particular precision of someone who had been building toward it since they sat down. Logan held Carol's gaze and took a breath and said the most honest thing he could that also happened to be true. I think she's working very hard at something that costs her a lot. Whether happy is the right word, I don't know. I think she's doing what she believes she's supposed to do. Carol was quiet. Then she said, "That's a careful answer. It's an honest one." She studied him for another moment, and whatever she was measuring, he must have come out on the right side of it, because she nodded once and moved the conversation elsewhere. Across the table, Victoria was talking with Patterson and didn't appear to be watching them. But when Logan reached for the breadbasket, her hand briefly touched his arm, the lightest possible contact, gone in a second, and he understood that she had been watching, that she always was, and that the touch was a small and silent thank you. After dinner, on the elevator down, Patterson shook Logan's hand with a warmth that was different from his greeting warmth, more settled, like something had shifted in his accounting of the situation. "Good man," Patterson said to Victoria before the elevator doors opened. Victoria smiled. "I know," she said. In the lobby, walking toward the exit, she said quietly, "What did you say to Carol? That you work hard and it costs you something." A pause. "That's more honest than our brief called for." She would have seen through anything else. "I know, that's why I'm not upset about it." She pushed through the glass door ahead of him. "I'm just noting it." They drove back in a silence that was different from the ride out, less managed, like two people who had spent an evening performing something and could now stop performing, not because the performance was over, but because it required less effort than it had before. He pulled up to her building, and she got out and then stopped, one hand on the door. "Logan?" "Yeah." She seemed to be working towards something. Whatever it was, she revised it before it arrived. "Drive safe," she said, and closed the door, and walked into the lobby. He sat in the truck for a moment longer than necessary. Then he drove home. 3 weeks into the arrangement, Logan started to understand the specific economics of Victoria's life. Not the financial kind, but the human kind. She operated on a deficit model. Everything she put out had to be replenished from somewhere, and the place she normally replenished from was isolation, her apartment, her office after hours, long drives alone. He knew this because he'd asked, once, what she did to decompress, and she'd looked at him with the slight confusion of someone who doesn't entirely recognize the category. "I work," she said. "That's not decompressing. That's more compressing. It's familiar. Familiar is restful. Familiar is just comfortable pressure instead of unfamiliar pressure." She'd looked at him with that expression she got sometimes, the one that was somewhere between irritated and curious, like he'd said something she was going to have to think about later against her will. He'd also started to understand the shape of what Damien Wolf was doing, and it was more sophisticated than he'd initially given it credit for. It wasn't crude sabotage. It was erosion. Wolf was working through information, selectively placed stories in trade publications, questions raised in private conversations with board members, a slow drip of doubt about Victoria's judgment and stability. Nothing that could be confronted directly. Everything designed to accumulate. Logan knew about erosion. He'd watched it happen in his marriage. Not one catastrophic failure, but 100 small ones, each individually survivable, collectively terminal. Janet hadn't wanted to leave, and he hadn't wanted her to go, and by the time either of them fully understood what was happening, they were already on the other side of it. He thought about this on a Tuesday morning while he was replacing a clutch cable on a Honda Shadow, his hands doing the familiar work while his head went elsewhere. The radio was on low. Emma's drawing from last week was taped to the wall above the tool shelf. The horse with the revised legs, which she'd brought back to show him with serious satisfaction. The shop smelled like it always smelled. Outside the window, a September sky was doing things with the light that had no name in a coloring box. His phone buzzed. "Victoria. Damien called an emergency board session for Friday. I need you there." He called her back instead of texting. "What happened?" he said. Her voice was controlled, but the frequency underneath it was higher than usual. "He circulated a document to the board last night, a financial analysis ostensibly about Q3 projections, but buried in the appendix is a note questioning the charter provision compliance. He's saying the engagement hasn't been formally verified, and until it is, my eligibility is in doubt. Can he do that? He just did. She paused. Sandra is preparing a response. We need documentation, the engagement, something formal, something I can put in front of the board. A ring, Logan said. Another pause. That's the most visible signal, yes. You don't have one. I'm aware. I was going to purchase. I'll handle it. Silence. Logan, you don't need to. I said I'll handle it. What time Friday? 2:00. I'll be there. He hung up and stood in his garage for a moment looking at the Honda. Then he wiped his hands and locked the shop for the first time in the middle of a workday and drove to the jewelry district. He didn't know much about engagement rings. He knew what he could afford to spend on something he'd eventually be giving back, which narrowed the field considerably. And he knew, from some operating principle he couldn't have fully articulated, that Victoria Hayes was not a woman who wanted something enormous and showy, whatever people might expect of a CEO. The woman kept a clean desk and wore small earrings and drove a black SUV that was expensive but not flagrant. He found it in the third place he looked, a white gold band with a single oval stone, set low and close, not trying to announce itself. The woman behind the counter was in her 40s and had the patient expertise of someone who had helped a lot of people through this particular kind of decision. For an engagement, she said. Something like that, he said. She looked at him with the mild assessment of a professional. The setting on this one is an antique-style profile. It's understated. Some people want something more prominent. She's not a prominent setting person. You know her well. He thought about that for a second. I'm learning, he said. He bought it. The cost went on his credit card, the one that had room on it since the debt restructuring Victoria's attorney had set in motion. He drove back to the shop with the small box in his jacket pocket and finished the clutch cable job and didn't think about what it meant to have bought an engagement ring for a woman he was pretending to be engaged to, because thinking about it too hard led somewhere he didn't have time to go. She writes, Emma found out about Friday's board meeting in the way Emma found out about most things. Not because anyone told her directly, but because she was paying attention. She was doing homework at the kitchen table Thursday evening when Logan came in later than he'd planned, still in the clothes he'd put on that morning, wearing the expression that she'd named the face. She watched him make a sandwich and eat half of it standing at the counter before she said, Something's happening tomorrow. Work thing. The other work. She had started calling it that, the other work, with a matter-of-factness that somehow made it worse than if she'd made a big deal of it. She pulled her math worksheet toward her. Is it going to be okay? That's what we're trying to make sure of. We meaning you and her? He looked at his daughter. She was doing long division and tracking the political situation of his fake engagement simultaneously, which felt about right for Emma. Yeah, he said. Me and her. Emma erased something on the worksheet with the methodical focus she brought to corrections. She remembered my horse, Emma said. What? When I showed her the one with the fixed legs, she remembered I said the other legs were wrong. She remembered that. Emma said it like she was noting a data point. People don't always remember small stuff. Logan put the rest of the sandwich in the wrapper and didn't finish it. No, he said. They don't. Emma looked up at him. I'm just saying, she said. Then she went back to the long division. The board meeting was in the same glass tower as Victoria's offices, but in a different conference room, longer table, darker wood, the specific formality of a space designed to make everyone in it feel like their decisions carried weight. Logan arrived at 1:45 in the charcoal suit, and Victoria met him in the hallway outside. She looked at his jacket pocket. Did you? Yeah. She held out her hand, not with ceremony or performance, just practically. He opened the box and she looked at the ring for a moment. Her expression was careful and unreadable, in the way it got when she was managing something internally. It's right, she said quietly. I thought you'd want something that wasn't trying too hard. She looked up at him. You're observant. Occupational hazard. You learn to read what's wrong with something by looking at it. She almost said something. Then she straightened and her face settled back into the composed professional mask, and she slid the ring onto her finger and looked at it once more. It fit well enough, close enough not to slide, not so tight it pulled. He noticed her swallow once, very controlled. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. Then, "Logan?" "Yeah." "If this doesn't go well today, it'll go well." "You can't know that." "No, but I'm not going in there already preparing for it to fail. That's not useful." He held her gaze. "We do what we can. The rest is on them." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she nodded and walked through the conference room door, and Logan followed. There were 7 board members present. Patterson and Corinne Liu were there, positioned along the left side of the table. Damian Wolf sat 2 seats from the head of the table, calm and assembled, with a legal pad in front of him and the practiced stillness of a man who had prepared for every version of this room. He glanced at Logan's entrance with exactly the right amount of neutrality. Not surprise, he would never give that. Just a brief assessment, eyes moving from Logan's face to Victoria's left hand and back. Something in his jaw tightened a fraction. Sandra Park presented the engagement documentation first. Formal announcement, notarized date, 2 witnesses, clean and straightforward. Wolf's attorney, a pale man named Greer, who wore his credentials visibly, raised a hand. The board's question isn't procedural, it's one of legitimacy. Any arrangement entered into primarily to satisfy a charter clause. The charter provision specifies formal engagement, Sandra said. It contains no language about the circumstances or the timeline of that engagement. You're arguing a standard that the document itself doesn't set. We're arguing the spirit. Corporate law doesn't run on spirit, Mr. Greer. It runs on language. Wolf let the attorneys argue it for 10 minutes. Then he leaned forward with the measured calm of a man making a reasonable point. "I want to be clear," he said, "that no one here is questioning Victoria's competence. What we're asking, what the board deserves, is reasonable assurance that this engagement is what it appears to be, given the timing." The room went quiet in the way conference rooms do when something has been said that everyone has been thinking. Logan spoke for the first time. "What would reasonable assurance look like to you?" he said. Wolf looked at him. A pause. Short, calculated. "Perhaps a statement from Mr. Mercer, his perspective on the relationship." It was a trap. Logan knew it was a trap. The goal was to get him talking on the record in a formal setting, in front of people who would be measuring every word for inconsistency, for the particular flatness of something rehearsed, for any crack in the story wide enough to lever open. Logan leaned back in his chair slightly. "You want me to talk about my relationship with Victoria in a board meeting," he said. "Not a question, just the fact of it, placed on the table. If you're comfortable, I'm comfortable." He looked around the table, taking his time. "Victoria and I met because I was in a bad year and she was in a worse one, and we got in each other's way at the right moment. That's not a press release story. That's just what happened." He paused. "She's difficult and she works too much, and she's been carrying things alone for so long she has trouble remembering she doesn't have to. And I'm a mechanic who lives 20 minutes from where he grew up and drives a truck that needs new tires and has a kid who corrects his drawings when the horse legs are wrong." He stopped. "I'm not what you expected her to bring in here, and I understand that gives you a reason to be skeptical. That's fine. But I'm not going to perform a relationship for a boardroom. What you're looking at is what's there." The room was quiet. He could feel Victoria beside him, perfectly still, not touching him, but a stillness that was somehow a different texture than it had been before he started talking. Patterson cleared his throat. "I think that's sufficient," he said. Wolf looked at Greer. Something passed between them, a small adjustment, a recalculation. And Wolf's expression settled into the smooth neutrality of a man who knew when a room had moved against him and had already started planning the next approach. "We'll table the compliance question pending the shareholder vote," Corinne Liu said, in the tone of someone closing a door firmly. "Unless anyone has new procedural grounds to raise." Nobody did. They walked out into the hallway and the elevator doors closed behind them, and Victoria exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. "That was either very good or very stupid," she said. "I know. You went completely off script." The script wasn't going to work in there. She looked at him. He looked at the elevator numbers counting down. You told them I work too much, she said. You do. In a board meeting. They know you do. They all know that. Pretending otherwise would have been the tell. He glanced at her. Did it land wrong with you? A pause. The elevator reached the lobby and the doors opened and they stepped out into the marble atrium and the sound of the building. Phone calls, foot traffic, the hum of the HVAC came back in. No, she said. It didn't land wrong. She was looking at the ring on her finger and then she stopped looking at it and looked at him instead. You said I have trouble remembering I don't have to carry things alone. Yeah. Is that true? From your observation? Yeah. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the glass front of the building, the September afternoon was doing something nice with the light. The angle was low and golden, and it came through the windows in long planes across the marble floor. My father used to say something like that, she said. It was the first time she'd offered something about her father without being asked. He used to say I was the only person he knew who treated help like a personal failure. Logan said nothing because there was nothing to say to that would have been better than silence. They walked out of the building into the afternoon, and they stood on the sidewalk for a moment, and the city moved around them with its ordinary urgency, and neither of them said anything else about it. After a minute, she said she had a call in 20 minutes, and she'd be in touch about next steps, and he said okay, and walked to his truck. He sat in the truck and looked at his hands on the steering wheel. Mechanic's hands, knuckled, rough at the fingertips, permanently carrying a faint trace of grease in the creases that no amount of washing fully reached. He thought about the look on her face in the lobby when she'd stopped looking at the ring and looked at him instead. Not the composed face, not the CEO face, the other one, the one that showed up in unguarded moments, the one she didn't know she was making. He started the truck and drove home through the golden afternoon. That evening, Patrice called. I saw the trade magazine, Patrice said. Not hello, not preamble. Patrice had never been interested in preamble. The one with the interview. Okay. You look uncomfortable in the photo. I am uncomfortable in the photo. The things you said, though. A pause. That was real, Logan. The stuff about the armor. That's something you actually think. He was standing in the kitchen again, leaning against the counter, Emma's homework spread on the table behind him. It's a complicated situation, he said. I know it's complicated. I'm not questioning the situation. I'm noting... She stopped and recalibrated, which was unusual for Patrice. I'm noting that when you talk about her, it doesn't sound the way it did when you described it to me 3 weeks ago. It's still what it is. I know what it is legally. I'm talking about how it sounds when you talk about her. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something. Emma was in her room, probably doing the new horse drawing she'd mentioned, the one with a mountain behind it. I'm being careful, he said. Okay, Patrice said. I mean it. I know you mean it. She paused. Being careful and successfully being careful are two different things. Patrice, I love you. I'm just saying. She shifted the phone. He could hear it. How's Emma doing with all of this? She mentioned Victoria remembered something small about her, the horse drawing. Patrice was quiet for a moment on the other end. That's not nothing, she said finally. I know it's not nothing. Emma's going to... I know, Patrice. Neither of them said what they both knew, which was that Emma had already lost one person who had been present in her life for a while and then wasn't, and that Emma knew this had nothing to do with being good or bad or deserving, and that this knowledge was something Emma carried quietly, in that way she carried everything, and that it made her both more resilient and more fragile than she appeared. Just be straight with her, Patrice said. Whatever happens. She can handle the truth. She can't handle finding out later you weren't straight with her. I'm always straight with her. I know you are. A brief silence. Okay, that's all I've got. Tell Emma I'm coming for her Wednesday. She hung up. Logan stood in the kitchen for a while after. Then he went and knocked on Emma's door and opened it. She was at her desk, the new drawing spread out in front of her, and she had taken out the violet pencil and was using it for the mountain shadow, which he would not have thought of and which was exactly right. How's the mountain? He said. The mountain's good. She didn't look up. Are you okay? Getting there, he said. She nodded without looking up, the violet pencil moving in careful strokes across the mountain's dark side, filling in the shadow without crossing the line. The week after the board meeting, things were quiet in the way that precedes something rather than follows it. Logan recognized this kind of quiet. He'd felt it in the shop sometimes, in the last weeks before a transmission finally gave out. Everything running, everything functional on the surface, but a faint vibration in the system that told you something was winding toward failure. You could hear it if you knew what to listen for. Most people didn't listen until the noise got loud. Victoria called twice that week, both times about logistics. An event on Saturday, a media briefing on Monday that her communications team wanted him to attend. He showed up for both. The Saturday event was a quarterly dinner hosted by a business association, and Logan sat through 3 hours of industry conversation and watched Victoria work the room and did his part when his part was needed. The Monday briefing was 20 minutes in a conference room with Brent, who had developed a cautious professional respect for Logan that expressed itself as slightly less condescension. They updated the narrative, added some details the magazine interview had generated organically, and Logan left feeling like he'd attended a meeting about himself that he hadn't been invited to. He didn't see Victoria outside of those contexts that week. They texted. Practical things, scheduling. And once she sent him a message at 11 at night that said only, "Patterson called. He's a yes." That's one more. And he'd written back, "Good. Get some sleep." And she'd responded, after a pause long enough to suggest she was considering whether to say it, "I'll try." Which probably meant she wouldn't. Emma asked about her once. Just once. She was eating cereal on a Saturday morning, and she said, without looking up from the bowl, "Is Victoria coming to anything this week?" Logan said no, not this week, and Emma said okay and went back to the cereal. He watched her do it, absorb the information, file it away, adjust, and felt that particular quiet weight that came with watching your child practice being resilient. The story broke on a Wednesday. Logan was at the shop, elbow deep in a Kawasaki transmission, when his phone started going. First one notification, then another, then a run of them coming fast enough that he pulled off his gloves and looked at the screen. A media outlet had run a story. The headline used the word actor in the first sentence. The subheadline said, "Sources close to Hayes Consolidated Board question authenticity of CEO's engagement." He read it standing next to the Kawasaki with grease on his forearms and his jaw set hard. The story was detailed in the way only deliberate sourcing produces. It mentioned his shop by name. It mentioned the debt. Not the exact figures, but the fact of it, framed as a possible financial motive. It mentioned Emma, just barely, just enough. Mercer is a single father, the story said. A detail sources suggest was selected to humanize the relationship for public consumption. They'd used his daughter as a data point in an exposure piece. He called Victoria. She picked up on the first ring. "I know," she said. "I've seen it. They mentioned Emma." "I know. Logan. They mentioned her by proximity, to frame the whole thing as manufactured." "I know." Her voice was controlled, but the control was costing something. "Sandra is already on it. We're reviewing for defamation, the sourcing is thin, and Brent is preparing." "I don't care about Brent's response right now." He stepped outside the shop into the parking lot because the walls were suddenly too close. Who gave them the debt information? That's not public record. A pause. "We believe it came from inside the board. Someone with access to the vetting Damien's team ran before the charter issue was raised." "So Wolf?" "Almost certainly." He stood in the parking lot and looked at the sky, which was doing nothing interesting. Flat gray, low ceiling, the kind of October sky that had already decided its mood for the day and wasn't taking suggestions. What happens to the board vote if this gets legs? We lose Patterson, probably. He's risk-averse. If the media narrative becomes one of fraud, then we're back to where you were 8 weeks ago. "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. "Logan, I'm sorry." She said it the way she said most things. Directly, without excess. But this time the directness felt like it was taking effort. "Emma should not have been in that article. That's not something I can undo, and it's not something I expected Damien to do, and I should have. I should have anticipated every vector, and I didn't anticipate that one, and I'm sorry." He believed her. That was the thing. He believed she was genuinely sorry, and he believed she genuinely hadn't anticipated it, and neither of those things made it better. "I need a day," he said. "Take what you need." "I'm not walking away. I'm saying I need a day before I do or say anything about this." "Okay. Don't let Brent release anything that mentions Emma. Anything at all. I'll make sure of it." He hung up and stood in the parking lot until the cold got through his shirt. Then he went back inside and put his gloves back on and finished the transmission, because there was nothing else useful to do right then, and work was the only thing he'd ever found that reliably held the space while he waited for his head to clear. And Patrice called that evening. Of course she did. "I saw it," she said. "I know." "They put Emma in there." "I know, Patrice." "Logan," her voice had dropped into the register she used when she was managing her own anger in order to be useful to him. "How are you?" "Tired." "How's Emma? Does she know?" "She's 8. She doesn't read trade media." "Her friends' parents do." That landed. He hadn't thought of it from that angle yet. The school, the other parents, the particular cruelty of adult information filtering down to children through the cracks. "I'll talk to her," he said. "What are you going to say?" "The truth. That her dad got mixed up in something complicated, and it ended up in a story, and if anyone says anything to her, she can tell them to talk to me." Patrice was quiet. "You're not walking away from this?" "Not yet." "Why not?" He thought about it. The honest answer was that he wasn't sure he could fully articulate it. It was less a decision than a position he found himself in when he checked. Something about the fear on Victoria's face in a parking lot. Something about the cold of her hand in his at a gala. Something about a woman who remembered that a child's horse had wrong legs. "Because I said I would see it through," he said, "and because Wolf did this deliberately, and I don't like being pushed." Patrice made the sound she made when she understood something she didn't entirely endorse. "Okay," she said. "Emma's got me Wednesday and Thursday this week, if you need it." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just be careful." Uptick. He talked to Emma the next morning before school. He sat on the edge of her bed while she put her shoes on, and he told her simply, someone wrote a story about him in a newspaper and mentioned her name, and she might hear about it. He said it wasn't anything bad, just complicated, and that if anyone said anything to her about it, she should tell him. Emma finished tying the second shoe and sat up straight and looked at him with those eyes that took everything in. "Was it a mean story?" she said. "It was an unfair one." She thought about this. "Is Victoria okay?" "She's dealing with it. Are you okay?" "Working on it." She picked up her backpack and stood. "Okay," she said with the pragmatic finality she'd developed for things she couldn't fix. Then, at the door, "If anyone says anything, I'll just say my dad handles it, and you will." She went to school. He sat on the edge of her bed for a moment after she left, looking at the room, the drawings taped to the wall, the small bookshelf with its leaning rows of chapter books, the violet pencil on the desk next to the unfinished mountain drawing, and felt the specific weight of being someone's whole sense of safety. It was the heaviest and most clarifying thing he knew. Victoria called that afternoon, and the call was different from the previous ones. Less managed, shorter intervals between words, the pacing of someone who had been sitting with something for a while and had decided to say it. "I found something," she said. "What kind of something?" "Security footage, from the media outlet. They're not the original source. They were fed the information. I had someone trace the document trail, and there's a gap in the chain, a meeting that shouldn't have happened. 2 weeks ago, Damien met with a man named Cole Riggs. Cole Riggs is a private security contractor who has done work for at least 3 corporations that Damien has previously acquired." Logan was quiet. "Cole Riggs was also photographed near your shop last week," she said. "My security team flagged it when they were pulling footage from the neighborhood after the article ran." "You have security watching my shop?" A brief pause. "I have security watching the perimeter of locations associated with this situation." "Yes, I should have told you." He let that sit for a moment. He wasn't sure whether he was angry about it or whether it was simply one more thing in a situation that had outgrown the original shape they'd put around it. "What does Cole Riggs being near my shop tell you?" "That Damien isn't done. The article was pressure, not an endgame. He's building something larger. What does Sandra say? That we need more before we can move legally. The footage of Riggs is circumstantial. The document trail has a gap but doesn't prove Damien was the source. She paused. Logan, I want you to know something. What I'm about to tell you. I didn't plan to tell you this because it makes me look like I've been holding information, which I have been. Tell me. 3 weeks ago, one of my internal security contacts found a reference to a company Damien has been funding quietly through a shell structure. It's a media acquisition, small, specialized, the kind of outlet that trades in corporate intelligence. I believe this is the outlet that ran the story. You've known for 3 weeks. I was building the case before I moved on it. If I went to the board with incomplete information, Victoria. He stopped her. I understand the strategy. I'm not saying you were wrong to be careful. I'm saying you should have told me. A long pause, long enough that he wasn't sure she was going to respond. Then, you're right, I should have. It was a simple acknowledgement. No qualification, no legal framing, no communication strategy. Just, you're right. He was learning that these were rare from her, and that made them mean something. Where are we now? He said. I'm compiling everything. The shell company documentation, the footage, the document trail. Sandra believes that if we can tie Riggs to Damien through the media piece and demonstrate a coordinated pattern, we have grounds to go to the board with a misconduct claim. That changes the dynamic entirely. How long? A week, maybe 10 days. And in the meantime, we hold, we maintain. We don't react to the article publicly because reacting gives it more weight. She paused. I know that's hard. It's not hard, he said. Hard is something else. He thought about Emma in the article. I've dealt with harder, at 13. The week that followed was the strangest of the arrangement so far, because nothing happened, and nothing happening required more active maintenance than anything that had happened before. The article had generated a cycle, pickup pieces in 3 other outlets, a sarcastic segment on a business news program that Logan watched for approximately 45 seconds before turning off, a cluster of social media commentary that his phone's algorithm decided he needed to see. He had 3 calls from local reporters asking for comment. He told all 3 versions of the same thing. I don't have anything for you. He said it without hostility, which was harder than saying it with hostility. 2 parents at Emma's school said something, not to Emma, to each other in the pickup line, in a way they probably thought was private but wasn't, because the pickup line at an elementary school has the acoustic properties of a confessional. Emma's teacher, a measured woman named Ms. Cortez, called Logan to let him know she was aware of it and would handle any classroom fallout. He thanked her. She said, Emma seems fine. She's a steady kid. He said, she is. He hung up and sat in the truck in the school parking lot for 2 minutes before driving back to the shop. The night before the situation changed, Logan drove out to the edge of town on no particular errand. It was something he did sometimes when the walls closed in. Not to get anywhere, just to drive. The county road ran out past the old industrial park and then into a stretch of nothing much, fields on both sides, the occasional farm light in the distance. He had the windows down even though it was cold and the radio off. He thought about his marriage, which he did less often than he used to. He and Janet had been good people who had done damage to each other in the specific way good people do, not with cruelty, but with accumulated neglect, with the failure to stay present when presence was hard. He'd been building the shop in those years, working the kind of hours that felt like sacrifice, but were also, honestly, easier than being home and managing 2 people's unhappiness. He'd known that about himself for a while now, knowing it hadn't fixed anything, but it had stopped him from telling the story wrong. He thought about Victoria telling him she'd been carrying things alone for so long she'd lost the habit of not carrying them. He thought about how he'd said that in a boardroom to 7 strangers, not because it was strategic, but because it was simply true, and the truth was the only thing he'd been able to come up with that wouldn't crack under examination. He drove back through town and went to sleep. The next morning, at 7:43, his phone rang. It was Patrice. Logan? Her voice was wrong. He sat up. What? Emma didn't come out. He was already standing. What do you mean she didn't come out? I'm in front of the school. I was picking her up. You called me yesterday. You said take her Wednesday. And her teacher came out and said Emma left in a car at 2:45, before the regular pickup. The teacher said there was a woman, and Emma went with her, and they assumed it was arranged. Patrice's voice was very controlled and very afraid, and the combination was the most frightening sound Logan had ever heard from her. Logan, I don't have her. The world went very small and very sharp. Call the police, he said. He was already moving. Right now, don't wait. Call them and stay at the school. I'm coming. He called Victoria while he was running to his truck. She picked up. Emma's gone, he said. Someone took her from school. The silence on the other end lasted less than 2 seconds. I'm calling my security team right now. Don't hang up. Oh. The next 4 hours were the worst of his life, by a margin he hadn't known existed before that day. He drove to the school, and the police were already there. 2 officers and a detective named Ramos, who asked the right questions and asked them fast. Ms. Cortez gave a description of the woman, mid-30s, dark jacket, confident manner, said she was a family friend, had shown something, possibly an ID, that the aide at the door hadn't looked at long enough. Emma had gone without apparent distress, which the detective said was significant, which Logan understood to mean Emma hadn't been frightened in the moment, which meant whoever had done this knew enough to seem familiar. Victoria arrived at the school 40 minutes later. She had 2 members of her private security team with her and a face that looked like someone had stripped every layer off it. She came to where Logan was standing near the detective, and she looked at him and she said, "My team is already pulling footage from the surrounding area, the shell company, Riggs. This is connected." "I know it's connected. Logan, find her." His voice came out flat and ground down to something very hard underneath. "That's all. Everything else is after. Just find her." She held his gaze. "We will," she said. He didn't tell her not to promise things she couldn't know. He just nodded because the alternative was something he couldn't afford right now. Detective Ramos came over. "Mr. Mercer, we've picked up a partial plate from a traffic camera on Route 9, heading east. We're running it now." "Route 9 East," Logan said. "Yes." He looked at the detective. "There's an industrial corridor out there. Old warehouses from when the freight park was operating. I know that road." Ramos looked at him steadily. "We're aware of the area. I need you to let us work this." "I understand." He did not intend to let them work it alone, but he said, "I understand," because saying otherwise would have cost him access to information he needed. Victoria's security contact, a short, precise woman named Darla, was on her phone 20 feet away. She looked up and caught Victoria's eye and held up 3 fingers. Victoria crossed to her immediately. Logan followed. 3 properties on Route 9 East, Darla said, showing Victoria a map on her phone. All 3 registered to shell entities. One of them traces back 2 levels to an LLC that matches the structure of the media acquisition. Industrial building, listed as storage, no active lease. Heat signature from the satellite pass an hour ago shows interior activity. Logan looked at the building on the map. He knew that corridor. He'd driven it the night before, not for any reason, just driving. The building was less than 8 miles from where he was standing. He looked at Victoria. She was already calling Ramos. The next hour ran in a way that Logan couldn't have assembled cleanly afterward if someone had asked him to. It happened in the order it happened, and there was no clean narrative shape to it, just the sequence of one thing and then the next. Ramos got the information, got a team moving, held Logan at the outer perimeter with a firmness that Logan respected and pushed against simultaneously. Victoria stood beside Logan at the perimeter barrier and didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. They were 2 people waiting for something that was either going to be okay or not going to be okay, and there was no useful sentence for that space. Logan's hands were still. He had spent 4 hours being afraid with his whole body. Tight chest, heightened everything, the specific physical signature of dread. And somewhere in the last 40 minutes it had shifted into something quieter and colder, a state he recognized from the worst nights of his divorce, from the morning after the shop's biggest client canceled, from the hospital waiting room years ago when Emma had a fever that scared the doctors, the state where the body stops running the emergency signal because the emergency is already here and you need everything you have left just to function. He heard radio traffic from Ramos's direction. Then Ramos turned and looked at him. We've got her, he said. Logan's legs didn't give out, but it was close. Emma came out through the building's side door with a female officer holding her hand, and she was walking on her own, and she was wearing the same jacket she'd worn to school that morning. And when she saw Logan at the perimeter line, she pulled away from the officer and ran. He caught her and went down on one knee and held on. She was shaking slightly. Not crying, Emma didn't cry easily, but shaking, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and he put his hand on the back of her head and held her there. And the October cold was on everything, and his eyes were burning, and he stayed exactly where he was for as long as she needed. After a while, she pulled back and looked at his face and said, in a voice that was trying to be steady, "I didn't go with them on purpose. I thought she was Ms. Patrice's friend." "I know, baby, I know. I kept trying to remember the route so I could tell the police." He looked at his daughter. 8 years old, and she'd been taken by strangers, and her response had been to memorize the route. "Did you?" he said. "Some of it." She thought about it with the same gravity she brought to the horse drawings. "I got 2 street signs and 1 big landmark." "That's good," he said. His voice wasn't entirely level. "That's really good." He stood up and kept her hand in his and turned around. Victoria was standing 10 feet away. She had stayed back, given him the distance, which was the right call, and he knew it was a deliberate one. She looked at Emma and then at Logan with an expression that had nothing composed about it. Everything had come off. She looked like someone standing in rain without having planned for it. Emma looked at her for a moment. Then Emma said, in the straightforward way she said most things, "You're here." "I'm here," Victoria said. Emma seemed to take this in. Then she leaned back against Logan's side and held on to his hand, and the 3 of them stood in the cold outside the warehouse while the police moved around them, and the afternoon light was going thin and flat the way it did in October when the warmth had already decided to leave. Ramos came over with a tablet. The partial plate had led to a vehicle registered to a company that matched the network Darla had traced. Inside the building, they'd found records, documents connecting the operation to Cole Riggs, and through Riggs back to a chain of directives that were going to require a forensics team and a federal review to fully unpack. "It's enough to open an investigation," Ramos said. "It's going to move fast from here." Logan nodded. He kept Emma's hand in his. "Mr. Mercer." Ramos hesitated, which was not his natural mode. "I'm sorry this happened to your daughter." "Yeah," Logan said. "So am I." Ramos moved away. Logan looked at the building. Gray walls, industrial. Nothing about it that would tell you from the outside what it had held for the last 8 hours. And he felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite relief, but lived somewhere between them, in the specific territory of a person who has been pushed to the edge of what they can absorb and found, at the bottom of it, that they are still standing. Victoria had come up beside him, not touching, just present, at the distance she kept. "Darla is sending everything to Sandra tonight," she said quietly. "The documents they found here, the paper trail on the shell company, the Riggs connection, combined with what we already had." "I know," he said. "It changes the board situation entirely." "I know." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Logan, I know that's not what matters right now." He looked at her sideways. Her face in the flat afternoon light, still stripped bare, still showing the version of her that didn't run the calculations first. "No," he said. "It's not what matters right now." Emma tugged his hand once, the small signal she used when she was ready to leave somewhere. He looked down at her. She was watching a bird on the warehouse roof with the mild observation she brought to birds generally, as if choosing to find something ordinary to focus on, which was, he thought, one of the more quietly remarkable things he'd ever seen a person do. "Let's go home," he said. "Okay," Emma said. Then she looked at Victoria. "You should eat something. You look like you forgot to eat." Victoria blinked. "She's not wrong," Logan said. Victoria looked at the 2 of them, and whatever she'd been about to say, she revised it into something simpler and more honest. "I don't really know how to do this," she said. "Not about food." Emma considered her with the direct seriousness of a child who doesn't attach unnecessary weight to admissions of difficulty. "That's okay," she said. "My dad didn't know how to braid hair either, and now he's okay at it." Logan made a noise that was not quite a laugh. Victoria looked at him. He looked at her. The warehouse was behind them, and the cold was settling in, and Emma was waiting with her hand in his. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, the fear and the anger and the relief and the complicated, stubborn feeling that had been building in him for 5 weeks without his permission, something shifted into a new position and stayed there. He didn't name it, not yet, but he knew it was there. Emma slept for 11 hours the night after the warehouse. Logan checked on her twice, once at midnight, once at 3, standing in the doorway of her room, listening to her breathe, which was something he hadn't done since she was an infant. She was on her side with one arm out over the covers and her face slack in sleep, and she looked very young, which she was, which he sometimes forgot when she was navigating the world with that particular competence of hers. In sleep, she was just a kid. 8 years old, narrow shoulders, hair loose from the braids. He didn't sleep much himself. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold, and he thought about the day, running it back, running it forward, looking at what he'd done and what he hadn't, where the gaps were, what it had cost. The specific fear of those 4 hours had metabolized into something that didn't have a clean name, a residue of adrenaline and relief, and the persistent, low-frequency anger of a person who has watched someone use their child as a lever. Cole Riggs had been in federal custody since 9 the previous evening. The woman who had taken Emma from the school, a contractor named Sheila Marsh who had worked for Riggs on 3 previous assignments, had been picked up 40 minutes after Emma was recovered. Detective Ramos had called Logan at 10:30 with the updates in a voice that was professionally neutral and personally relieved, which Logan appreciated. He thought about Victoria standing outside the warehouse, the face she'd had on, stripped of the composure, showing whatever was underneath it. He thought about Emma saying, "You should eat something," with the practical authority of a child who has decided to be okay about a frightening day. He thought about the 3 of them standing in the cold parking lot while the police moved around them, and the specific quality of that moment, held together by exhaustion and something else, something that didn't fit neatly in the categories he'd been using since the first night she walked into his garage. He went to sleep eventually, in the chair. Sandra Park called the next morning at 8:30. "The documents from the warehouse are extraordinary," she said, with the controlled excitement of an attorney who has just been handed a winning hand and is trying to be professional about it. "We have internal communications connecting Riggs directly to Damien's personal accounts, not corporate funds, personal. Authorization for the surveillance on Logan, authorization for the school operation, and most significantly, 4 years of correspondence regarding a financial scheme that has nothing to do with the charter provision and everything to do with why Damien wanted Victoria out." Logan was on his second cup of coffee, actually hot this time. "What scheme?" "Damien has been diverting acquisition funds through the shell company network. The media outlet was the visible arm, but the structure runs deeper. He's been siphoning from Hayes Consolidated for at least 4 years and using the shell entities to clean it. Victoria's permanent appointment as CEO would have triggered an internal audit. He wasn't trying to take over the company. He was trying to prevent an audit that would have exposed him." Logan set the mug down. "He kidnapped an 8-year-old to cover up embezzlement and to force Victoria to resign before the shareholder meeting. If she'd stepped down, the audit would have been delayed indefinitely under transitional review. He had another 6 months, minimum, to move the funds offshore." A pause. "We're filing a comprehensive complaint with federal investigators today. Ramos is coordinating with the Federal Financial Crimes Unit. The warrant for Damien's personal and corporate accounts was issued this morning." He thought about Damien Wolf's handshake face at the gala. Warm on top, cold underneath. "When does Victoria find out if she still has the votes?" "That depends on what she does today." Oh, Victoria had been awake since 5. This was not unusual. Her sleep patterns had always been poor, a fact she'd accepted about herself the way you accept things that have been true for long enough to feel structural. What was unusual was that she was not at her desk. She was sitting on the floor of her living room with her back against the couch and her knees up and a cup of tea going cold on the coffee table beside her, and she was doing something she almost never did, which was nothing. She'd driven herself home from the warehouse last night, which Darla had argued against, and which Victoria had done anyway, because she needed 40 minutes alone in a car to process the day before she had to be in a room with another person. She'd driven home, and she'd changed out of the clothes she'd been wearing, and she'd sat down on the floor. She was thinking about Logan's face when he heard Emma was gone. She'd been on the phone with him, and she'd heard the shift, the precise moment the voice changed from a person who was woken up early to a person who understood what was happening. It was a sound she couldn't have described with any precision, just a quality, a compression of everything a person was into pure function. She'd heard it, and something in her chest had responded to it in a way that had nothing to do with the company or the charter or Damian Wolf. She was thinking about the 4 hours that followed, the way Logan had held himself at the perimeter, very still, very controlled, and she had known exactly what that stillness was costing him, because she'd been doing the same thing standing beside him. And they hadn't spoken much, but the quality of the silence between them had been different from every previous silence they'd shared. Less managed. Something closer to the truth of both of them. She was thinking about Emma saying you should eat something with the cheerful directness of someone who had decided, in the aftermath of being taken by strangers, that the most useful thing she could do was notice that an adult in her vicinity had forgotten basic maintenance. She had eaten something, eventually. Alone in her apartment at 11 at night, reheated soup from a container in her fridge that she couldn't remember buying. She'd eaten it standing at the counter and thought about Emma and then stopped thinking about Emma because the feeling that produced was too much for 11 o'clock on a night that had already asked everything of her. She picked up her phone. She had 12 unread messages, 4 of them from Brent, 2 from the board's administrative coordinator, and 1 from Logan, sent at 6:47 in the morning. Emma slept through. She's okay. How are you? Not a question mark. The period was deliberate, not asking her to answer if she didn't want to, just putting the inquiry out there. She stared at the message for a moment, at the simplicity of it. She typed back, "Glad she slept. I'm okay. Not entirely true, but okay enough." She watched the 3 dots appear. That's enough for this morning. She put the phone down and looked at the ceiling and did not examine the feeling that produced. At 10 o'clock, Sandra called with the update on the documents and the federal warrant. Victoria listened through the whole thing without interrupting, which was on her natural mode, and when Sandra finished, she said, "What do we need for the board?" "Everything we have. I'd recommend requesting an emergency session. Given the scope of the federal investigation, any board member who has been aligned with Damian is going to be looking for distance right now. This is the moment." "Greer?" "Greer will have already called Damian's replacement attorney this morning. He's not going to fall with his client." Victoria stood up from the floor. She'd migrated from there to the window at some point, the city coming in through the glass with its ordinary morning noise, and started moving, because movement was how she thought. "I want Logan in the room." "Victoria, you don't need him for this. The legal case stands on its own. I know it stands on its own. I want him in the room." A pause. "I'll coordinate with his schedule." "Today. The session needs to be today, Sandra." "I know. I'll make the calls." Victoria hung up and stood at the window and thought about what today would require of her. There was a version of this she knew how to do. The composed version, the prepared version, the version where she walked into a board meeting with the right documents and the right language and won on procedure. She'd run that play before. She was good at it. What was different today was that she wasn't sure she wanted to run it that way. She thought about what Logan had done in the board meeting 2 weeks ago when he'd gone completely off script and told 7 strangers the actual truth, and how that had worked, and why it had worked. She thought about Carol Patterson asking, "Do you think she's happy?" and Logan saying the most honest thing available to him, not the most strategic thing. She had been strategic for a very long time. She had been good at it. And a man had still found a way to use her company's money and a private contractor and an 8-year-old girls' school as instruments of his own protection. Strategy had not been enough. She called Logan herself. "Can you be at the office by noon?" she said. "I'll be there." "Emma, Patrice is with her. She's okay. I talked to the school. Miss Cortez is going to check on her through the day." "Logan?" She stopped, restarted. "What I'm going to do today, in the board meeting, I'm going to do it differently than I've been doing things. I'm going to say what's actually true, not just the legal truth. All of it." A pause on his end. "Okay. That might be uncomfortable." More uncomfortable than a warehouse in October? She exhaled. It was the closest thing to a laugh she'd managed in 18 hours. Fair point. I'll be there at noon, he said. She arrived at the office at 11 and spent 45 minutes with Sandra reviewing the documentation sequence, and then she spent 15 minutes alone in her office doing something she almost never did before a significant meeting, which was sitting quietly without preparing anything further. Just sitting, letting the day before settle into its actual place rather than managing it into storage. The photograph of her father was on the shelf behind the desk, the same one that had been there since she moved into the office, the one from a company anniversary party years ago. Richard Hayes, in a dark jacket looking at something off camera with the expression he'd had when something genuinely pleased him. She looked at it for a moment. You'd have something to say about all of this, she thought. She didn't know if it would have been the right thing or the wrong thing. He'd been a complicated man, brilliant, demanding, occasionally unjust in small ways, and fundamentally on her side with a consistency she'd only fully appreciated after he was gone. She missed him with the specific ache of unfinished business, of things that had needed more time. Logan knocked on the open door. She looked up. He was in the charcoal suit, slightly less pressed than the first time, the way anything gets when you've worn it multiple times under real conditions. He looked like a man who had not slept enough and had decided that was fine. Nice suit, she said. Don't start. I wasn't criticizing. I was noting. She stood up. How are you, actually? Ask me after. Fair. They walked together to the boardroom. The session was attended by all 7 board members. No one had declined, which meant the news of the morning had moved fast enough to make attendance feel necessary. Greer was absent. Damian Wolf was not present, which was either because he'd been advised not to attend or because the morning's developments had already made the calculation clear to him. 2 of his previously aligned board members, a man named Fowler and a woman named Strand, were present and sitting at maximum distance from where Wolf normally sat, which was the kind of positioning that tells you everything about how people read a shifting room. Sandra presented the documentation first. She was methodical and precise and did not hurry, and the room grew progressively quieter as the scope of it became clear. The shell company network, the diverted funds, the Riggs connection, the school operation. The paper trail that moved from Damien's personal accounts through 3 layers of shell entity and ended in a private contractor's operational log. When Sandra finished, Patterson spoke first. This is federal criminal territory. The investigation opened this morning, Sandra confirmed. Fowler, who had been Wolf's most vocal ally 3 weeks ago, was looking at his hands on the table. Strand had her eyes on the document summary in front of her, and her face was doing careful, meticulous nothing. Victoria spoke. She didn't open with the prepared remarks, which she'd written and then set aside. She opened with, My father built this company over 40 years. He made it something. He also made mistakes. The charter provision was one of them, because it turned the leadership of a corporation into a vulnerability that someone was willing to exploit. She paused. I've spent the last 8 weeks managing this situation strategically. And while I was managing it strategically, Damian Wolf was moving faster than my strategy accounted for. He had a child taken from her school. Her voice didn't waver, but the effort to hold it level was visible, which she'd decided was all right. Not to hurt me. To cover a theft. That's what the last 8 weeks have actually been about. Not the charter, not my eligibility. A theft. The room was very still. I'm asking the board today to do 2 things. Formally acknowledge the misconduct finding and refer it to the federal process already underway, and proceed to the shareholder vote on my permanent appointment. She looked around the table. If anyone believes the evidence is insufficient, I'll hear that argument. I don't think anyone does. Nobody made the argument. Logan had said nothing. He was sitting 2 seats to Victoria's right, and he was doing what he did in rooms, present, watching, not performing anything, which was in its own way more stabilizing than any prepared contribution could have been. She was aware of him there the way you're aware of solid ground. Patterson called for a procedural motion. Corinne Liu seconded it. The referral to federal investigators passed 7-0. The vote on Victoria's permanent appointment, moved to today's session by unanimous consent of the quorum, passed 6-0, with Fowler abstaining, which was not a yes but was also not the floor falling out. It was enough. It was more than enough. 1. They walked out of the boardroom and into the hallway, and the door closed behind them, and Victoria stood still for a moment. Not performing stillness, just stopped, the way you stop when something that has been driving you for months has suddenly resolved and your body needs a second to register the change. 6-0, Logan said. 6-0, she said. She looked at the ring on her hand, the white gold band, the oval stone set low. She'd been wearing it for 3 weeks and had stopped consciously seeing it sometime in the last 10 days, which meant something she wasn't examining right now. So the arrangement, she started. Yeah. The shareholder meeting is in 4 days. Once the formal appointment is confirmed, the charter provision amendment goes to committee, and then it's… She stopped. The 6 months was the original timeline. We're at 7 weeks. Logan looked at her. What are you saying? I'm saying the primary purpose of the arrangement has been met. She stopped again. This was not a conversation she'd prepared for, which was unusual, which was also telling her something. You're free to end it. We can call a quiet mutual ending whenever you want. That was always the option. He held her gaze for a moment. Is that what you want? She opened her mouth and closed it. The hallway was empty. From somewhere in the building came the distant sound of the elevator opening, phones ringing at the front desk, the ordinary noise of a company continuing to operate. She looked at the ring again. I don't know what I want, she said. I know that's not a useful answer. It's honest. I specialize in strategy. This is not a situation that responds well to strategy. No, he said. It doesn't. She looked at him. Really looked, without running a calculation on top of it. He was standing in the hallway in his charcoal suit, with his arms at his sides and his face showing the same thing it always showed, which was exactly what was there, no more and no less. A man who meant what he said and didn't say what he didn't mean, and had sat with her in the worst day she'd had in years and hadn't flinched. Logan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. That's generally what I do. The things you said in that first board meeting, about carrying things alone, about armor. She held his gaze. Were you talking about me specifically, or were you talking about yourself? He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. Both, he said finally. She nodded, very slowly. Something settled in the room between them, and it wasn't resolution. It was more like the acknowledgement of something that had been present for a while and was tired of not being acknowledged. I have a company to run, she said. I know. And you have a shop. And Emma. I know that too. She stopped. This is not uncomplicated. No, he said, it's not. I don't know how to do this. Not the company. This. I know you don't. He said it without judgment, without trying to fix it, just as a fact. I'm not asking you to have it figured out. She stood in the hallway and looked at him, and felt something she'd been managing away from the edges of her attention for 7 weeks settle into the center of it. It was not comfortable. It was not neat. It was the specific kind of feeling that arrives without an agenda and refuses to be strategy-proofed. I need to go deal with the federal investigators, she said. Sandra has the first call at 3. Okay. After this week, when things stabilize, she stopped. Can we talk? Not a scheduled event, not a briefing, just talk. He looked at her for a long moment. Yeah, he said, we can do that. She nodded. She straightened not entirely back to the composed version, but finding some middle register that was honest rather than managed. She started down the hallway toward her office, and then she stopped and turned. Logan, he raised an eyebrow. Thank you. For the board meeting, for the warehouse, she paused. For Emma finding someone you trusted enough for her being the kind of kid she is. You did that. That was you. He held her gaze without answering right away, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet. She found you in a doorway on her own. That part wasn't me. Victoria held that for a moment. Then she turned and walked down the hall and didn't let him see her face, because her face was doing something she hadn't given it permission to do, and she needed another hour before she was ready for that. Damian Wolf's corporate accounts were frozen by federal order at 4:17 that afternoon. Logan heard about it from Sandra, who called to update him on the case timeline, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of an attorney watching a meticulous effort pay off. The investigation was expected to be extensive. 4 years of shell entity transactions didn't unwind in a week, but the immediate threat to Victoria's position was over. The shareholder vote was scheduled and uncontested. The charter provision amendment was already in committee. He drove home through the late October afternoon, the light thin and gold the way it got when the year was winding down. The leaves on the trees along his street had mostly gone, the ones still hanging on doing the final work of the season in orange and dark red. And there was the particular smell in the air that October always carried in this part of the state. Wood smoke from somewhere, cold earth, the end of something. Patrice's car was in his driveway. He came in to find Emma at the kitchen table with a new drawing, and Patrice at the counter with a cup of coffee, and the kitchen was warm and smelled like something had been cooked, and the ordinariness of it hit him somewhere between the chest and the throat. "I made soup," Patrice said. "You were going to eat cereal for dinner, and I wasn't having it." "I wasn't going to eat cereal." "You absolutely were." Emma looked up from the drawing. "How did it go?" "Good," he said. "It went good?" She studied him with those eyes. "For real?" "For real." She went back to the drawing, which appeared to be a new horse with a dramatically better grasp of equine anatomy. Patrice looked at Logan over the rim of her coffee cup with the expression she used when she was holding something she intended to say later. She said it after Emma was in bed. They sat at the kitchen table and Patrice wrapped both hands around her mug and said, "You're going to tell me it's complicated." "It is complicated. Everything worth having is complicated." She paused. "Is she good to you, Logan? For real this time?" He thought about the hallway outside the boardroom, about "I don't know how to do this," said without deflection, about a woman who had stood in a cold parking lot outside a warehouse and waited for him to hold his daughter before she let herself show anything. "She's trying to be," he said. "She's not practiced at it." "Are you?" He looked at his sister. "Not particularly." Patrice nodded. "Good," she said. "People who are too practiced at it usually learned from being hurt too many times, and that's not a foundation." She stood up, carried her mug to the sink, rinsed it. "Emma asked me tonight if Victoria was going to keep coming around." He looked at the table. "I told her I didn't know," Patrice said. "I told her some things take time to figure out." She turned around and leaned against the counter. "What did you tell her?" "I haven't told her anything yet." "She's going to ask you." "I know." "What will you say?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'll tell her the truth," he said, "that I don't know exactly what shape it takes yet, but I know it's real, and real things take time." Patrice looked at him for a long moment with the expression she'd worn since they were children, the one that was his older sister in his person and the most reliable truth-teller in his life, and she said, "Okay." She got her coat and her keys, and she hugged him at the door with the kind of hug that says more than the conversation did, and she left. Logan stood in the quiet kitchen for a while. The soup was on the stove, still warm. Emma's latest horse was on the table, this one with a proper neck and the legs finally right, standing in a field under a sky that was colored in violet at the edges, the way skies get just before a storm when the light does a specific thing. He picked it up and looked at it. Then he got a piece of tape and put it on the wall next to the window, where the evening light would hit it right. The shareholder meeting was on a Thursday. Victoria wore charcoal gray, not black, which would have read as mourning, and not the navy of the gala, which belonged to a different chapter. Charcoal gray was the color of something resolved. She stood at the head of the table in the main boardroom with 53 shareholders present and another 22 attending remotely, and she was formally and permanently appointed CEO of Hayes Consolidated by a vote of 48-7, the 7 being shareholders who had purchased their positions through entities connected to Damian Wolf's network and who would themselves be subject to review once the federal investigation ran its course. Sandra sent Logan a text during the vote, 47-3, then 48-7. It's done. He was under a motorcycle at the time, a 1971 Norton Commando that a collector had trucked in from 3 states away, the most interesting project he'd had in a year. He read the message with grease on his thumb and lay still for a moment on the shop floor, looking up at the undercarriage, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight for 2 months. He texted back, "Good." Then he went back to the Norton. Victoria called at 3 after the official session had closed and the press statement had gone out, and Brent had managed the initial media cycle into something functional. She sounded different from any previous version of herself he'd heard on the phone. Not elated exactly, not the performed relief of someone who had won something they'd expected to win. More like a person standing in a room after the furniture has been rearranged and recognizing that this is now what the room looks like. "It's done," she said. "I know," Sandra texted. "Of course she did." A pause. "How's the shop?" "Good. I've got a 1971 Norton in that I've been looking forward to for 3 weeks." "What's wrong with it?" He told her. Not a summary. The actual details. The specific list of what needed doing. The particular challenge of sourcing original parts for a bike that age. She listened, and he could tell she was actually listening rather than waiting for him to finish, which was the thing about her that had surprised him most consistently over 2 months. She was genuinely interested in things outside her domain when the pressure was off enough for that interest to surface. "You love it," she said when he finished. "The restoration work?" "Yeah." "You sound different talking about it." "Different how?" "Like you're not measuring your words." A pause. "You always measure your words with me." He set down the socket wrench he'd been holding. "So do you." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to come by the shop." "The shop?" "Not a restaurant or a boardroom or a gala. The shop." Another pause. "If that's all right?" He looked at the Norton. He looked at the fluorescent tube he'd finally replaced last week, the new light clean and white where the dying one had buzzed. He looked at Emma's first horse drawing, still taped above the tool shelf, the horse with the wrong legs that Emma had since improved upon multiple times, but which Logan had never taken down. "Yeah," he said. "It's all right." She came on a Saturday morning, not the SUV. She drove herself in a smaller car he hadn't seen before, something practical and dark blue that was 3 years old. He was in the parking lot when she pulled in, having just seen off a customer, and he watched her get out and look at the building with the same focused attention she brought to most things. She was wearing jeans. He'd never seen her in jeans. A dark green jacket, hair down, the ring still on her hand. She looked younger without the context of board meetings and galas and the professional armor that went with them. She looked like a person who had given herself a Saturday. "Nice car," he said. "It's what I drive when I'm not being driven somewhere." "Do you know how to park it yourself, or does someone handle that too?" She gave him the look. "I know how to park a car, Logan. I'm just checking." She walked past him into the shop and stood in the middle of the floor the way she'd stood in it the first night, taking it in, getting her bearings, except that this time she wasn't soaking wet, and she wasn't afraid, and she wasn't asking for anything. She was just looking. "It's different in the daylight," she said. "Everything is." She walked over to the Norton. She looked at it with the careful attention of someone who didn't know motorcycles but respected the object. "This is the one you were telling me about." "Yeah. It's beautiful." "It will be. Right now it's a project." She ran a finger along the tank, light and careful, the way you touch something old that you know has a history. "How do you know what it's supposed to look like when you're done?" He thought about it. "You find reference, original factory documentation, photographs from the period, other examples if you can get access to them, and then you make judgment calls when the documentation runs out, based on what you know about how things were made then, what materials they used, what they were trying to achieve. And if you get it wrong, you do it again." She looked at him. "Is it ever discouraging, finding out something you spent time on was wrong?" "Sometimes. Mostly it's just information." He picked up a rag and wiped his hands, the gesture so habitual he barely registered it. "You can't be precious about the work. If you fall in love with your first version of something, you'll keep it even when it's wrong." She held his gaze for a moment, and they both knew they weren't only talking about the Norton. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said, "in the hallway, after the vote." "Which part?" "Both of it." She turned back to the bike, which was easier to look at than him, apparently. "That you were talking about yourself too, the armor, the carrying things." He waited. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since Thursday," she said, "about the last 2 months, about what actually happened versus what I thought was happening when I walked in here that first night." She paused. "I walked in here to recruit an asset, someone with the right profile for the situation I was in. That was the full extent of what I thought I was doing." "I know. And you signed a contract with me because you needed the debt relief, and because you're the kind of person who helps someone when they're frightened, even when you shouldn't. I know that too." She turned around. "What I didn't account for," she said, "was that you'd be the most honest person I've spent sustained time with in years, that you wouldn't perform anything, that you'd say hard things at the wrong moments, and they'd be right." She stopped. "I didn't account for Emma." He was very still. "I didn't account for what it feels like to be in a room with the two of you. How ordinary it is. How it doesn't ask anything of me that I can't actually give." She was looking at him now and not looking away. "I'm not good at this. I want to be transparent about that. I've been alone in the functional sense for so long that I've stopped being sure I know how not to be. I work too much and I overthink everything, and I have approximately zero instinct for the domestic ease that you and Emma have built, and I'd probably get things wrong in ways that cost something." "Yeah," he said. She blinked. "That's it? Yeah?" "I work too much too. I spent 2 years building a shop instead of a marriage. I'm not easy to be with either." He set the rag on the workbench. "Nobody who's actually a person is easy to be with. The question isn't whether you're easy. The question is whether you're worth the difficulty." She was quiet. "You are," he said, simply, without performance. Victoria Hayes, who had navigated shareholder meetings and board coups and federal investigations and the particular grief of losing a parent while running his company, stood in a motorcycle repair shop on a Saturday morning and looked at a man in work clothes and did something she hadn't done in front of another person in years. Her eyes went bright and she held it, barely. "I don't know how to start," she said. "I genuinely don't know what the first step looks like." "You came to the shop," he said. "That's the first step?" "That's the first step." She looked at the Norton. She looked at the drawing above the tool shelf, the horse with the wrong legs, Emma's first version, the one Logan had kept. She looked back at him. "Okay," she said. It didn't become simple after that. That would be the wrong story to tell, and it wouldn't be true, and more importantly, it would do a disservice to the actual thing, which was messier and slower and more real than simple. What happened was this. They started. Imperfectly, with wrong turns, with the friction of two people who had each built a life with walls in specific places and now had to negotiate those walls with someone else. The first month was mostly learning. Logan learned that Victoria's version of relaxing was still operating at a speed that most people would call working, and that pressing her to slow down produced the same expression as asking her to do something physically impossible. Not unwilling, just genuinely uncertain of the mechanism. He stopped pressing and started standing near her instead, which was different. She learned that Logan had a ceiling on words. He had a finite daily quantity of communication, and when it was spent, it was spent. And this was not a comment on her, but a fact about him. And sitting in the same room in comfortable silence was not rejection. It was actually something he was offering. Emma learned both of these things faster than either of them did. She watched, as she always watched, with that particular attention she brought to everything that mattered. She didn't push, didn't perform excitement, didn't do any of the things a child might do when something potentially good was entering their life. She just noted. She noticed that Victoria remembered things, specific things, small things, and she filed it away. She noticed that Logan moved differently when Victoria was in a room, slightly more at ease, the tight quality he carried when he was managing something alone less present. She filed that away too. One Sunday in November, she and Victoria were at the kitchen table while Logan was out getting groceries. Emma was working on a new drawing. She'd moved on from horses to architectural subjects, currently working on a detailed rendering of a bridge she'd seen in a photograph. And Victoria was reading through documents on her laptop, which was what Victoria did in any given room. They were not talking. They had been not talking companionably for 40 minutes. Emma looked up. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. Victoria looked up from the laptop. She held Emma's gaze and didn't do what an adult often does in that moment, which is deflect or soften or ask a clarifying question to buy time. She said, "I want to." Emma considered this. Wanting to and doing it are different. "I know, you're right." Victoria closed the laptop. "I can't promise you anything about how it all turns out. I don't think it's fair to make promises to kids about things adults can't fully control. But I can tell you that I'm trying and that I take it seriously." Emma was quiet for a moment, the pencil still in her hand. "My mom wanted to stay too," she said. Not as an accusation, just as information. Victoria absorbed this carefully. "I'm not your mom," she said. "I'm not trying to be. I know that space is its own thing and I'm not asking for it." "What are you asking for then?" Victoria thought about it. "I think I'm asking to be around," she said. "If that's okay." Emma turned her pencil over and looked at the eraser end. She did this when she was thinking. "Ms. Cortez has a plant," she said after a moment. "She talks to it. It's a big plant." Victoria blinked at the non sequitur. "Does it work?" "It's a really healthy plant." Emma looked up. "You could come to my school thing next week. There's a thing. Dad already said yes." "What's the thing?" "Arts night. I'm putting up 3 drawings. The bridge and 2 of the horse ones." She paused. "The first horse is wrong, but Dad said he likes it because it was first." Victoria looked at her for a long moment. "I'd like to come," she said, "if your dad says it's okay." Emma nodded with the finality of someone who has made a decision and is moving on. She opened the laptop back toward Victoria, returning it with a small business-like push, and went back to the bridge drawing. Victoria sat for a moment looking at the top of the child's head, at the careful focus she brought to the pencil moving across the page, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, which was that she was in the right place. Logan came in from the groceries 10 minutes later and found them in the same positions, Emma drawing, Victoria reading, and the quality of the room's silence told him something had happened, though neither of them said what. Emma looked up and said, "Victoria's coming to arts night." And Logan looked at Victoria, and Victoria looked at Logan, and he said, "Okay," and went to put the groceries away. He was unpacking the bags when Victoria came into the kitchen. "She asked me directly," Victoria said, keeping her voice low. "I wasn't going to lie to an 8-year-old about my intentions." "I know." He put a carton of juice in the fridge. "What did you tell her?" "That I want to stay, that I can't promise outcomes, but I can promise I'm taking it seriously." She leaned against the counter. "Was that wrong?" He looked at her. She was doing the thing where she checked herself, looking for the mistake, the miscalculation. He recognized it because he did it too, differently, with a different set of worries, but the same underlying motion. "No," he said. "That was right." She exhaled. "You don't have to be perfect at this," he said. "You just have to keep showing up." "I'm better at strategy than I am at showing up." "I know. Show up anyway." Damian Wolf was indicted on 11 counts in December: wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and 2 counts related to the kidnapping of Emma, which the federal prosecutor had insisted on pursuing independently from the corporate charges. Cole Riggs and Sheila Marsh had already pled out in exchange for cooperation, their testimony building the case that Wolf's defense team would spend the next 18 months trying and failing to dismantle. The trial, when it came, was not dramatic in the way courtroom dramas suggest. It was documentation and testimony and the slow, grinding machinery of evidence presented without flourish. Wolf was convicted on 9 of 11 counts. He was sentenced to 14 years. Logan didn't go to the sentencing. Victoria said she was going, that she felt she needed to be there for the record, for her father's company. He said he understood, and he stayed home with Emma, and they made dinner together, and Victoria called afterward from the courthouse steps in a voice that was flat with a specific kind of exhaustion that follows a chapter finally closing. 9 counts, she said. Sandra told me. It's over. Yeah. A pause. Logan. I know, he said, before she could finish whatever she was going to say. Come over. There's food. She came over. She sat at the kitchen table and ate the dinner that had been kept warm for her, and Emma sat across from her and told her about the book she'd started reading, which was about a girl who trained horses. And Victoria listened with the full attention she brought to things that mattered and asked questions that showed she was actually tracking the plot. Logan watched them and thought about a rainy night in October a year and a half ago, and the distance between that night and this one, and how the distance couldn't be measured in time. The shop expansion happened the following spring. Logan had been thinking about it for 2 years. The building adjacent to Mercer's Cycles, vacant since the auto parts store closed, with a footprint that would allow him to take on larger restoration projects, hire 1 or 2 people, build out the kind of space where you could do a full frame-off on a vintage bike and have room to work properly. The financing had never been possible before. It was possible now, between the debt resolution and 14 months of the shop running cleanly, and a small business loan that Sandra had connected him to an advisor about, because Victoria had mentioned his situation to someone who knew someone, which was a thing she did quietly and without making a production of it. He signed the lease on the expansion space in March. Victoria came to the shop the evening after he signed it, and he showed her the empty space. Concrete floor, industrial windows, high ceilings, nothing in it yet. She walked around the perimeter slowly, looking up at the ceiling, looking at the windows and where the light came in. "What goes here?" she said, standing in the middle. "Paint bay, climate controlled for proper curing," he pointed. "Frame racks and lift there. Workbenches along that wall with tool storage above." He turned. "Custom parts and upholstery station by the window for the light." She was listening with the specific quality she brought to his shop talk, not performed interest, actual engagement. "How long to get it operational?" 6 months if I don't rush it, 4 if I do. Don't rush it." He looked at her. "The Norton took 8 months, and it's perfect," she said. "Don't rush the thing you're building." He delivered the Norton to its owner in February. The collector had stood in Logan's parking lot and looked at the restored bike for a long time without speaking, and then he'd said, "I've had this frame for 20 years and I never thought I'd see it like this." Logan had said nothing because there wasn't anything to add to that, and the silence was its own answer. 4 or 5 months, he said. Something in between. Victoria nodded. She was looking at the window. The way the evening light was doing something specific with the dusty glass, turning it amber, the empty space behind it going warm with the last of it. She had her hands in her jacket pockets and her hair was down, and she looked like she'd finished a long day and come here to finish it properly, which was what she had done. "The company had its best quarter on record," she said. It wasn't a boast. She said it the way she said things she was still integrating. "The European restructuring I pushed through in Q1 came back stronger than the models projected. Patterson told me Richard would have been proud of the Q3 numbers." "Are you proud of them?" She considered that. "I'm relieved," she said. "And then I'm proud. The relief comes first." "That's not a bad order. My father would have been proud first." She said it without grief exactly, with a settled kind of wistfulness that comes when you've made peace with something hard. He was better at enjoying wins in the moment. "I'm working on it." Logan walked to the window and stood beside her. The amber light was doing something to the empty room that made it look like a painting of potential. All the space and none of the weight. He'd have liked this, Victoria said, and he wasn't sure if she meant the room or the evening or the two of them standing in it. "Probably," he said. She turned and looked at him in the light, and whatever she saw apparently satisfied something because she leaned her head against his shoulder and stayed there, not dramatically, not as a statement, just as a person who was tired in a good way putting their weight somewhere they trusted. He put his arm around her. They stood in the empty space for a while, the amber light going slow through the dusty windows, the city doing its quiet spring evening thing outside. In April, on a Saturday that started like all the other Saturdays that had accumulated into something recognizable as a life, Emma's cereal, the neighbor's dog, the radio low in the kitchen, Logan drove to the shop. He drove the same route he'd driven for 9 years, past the school and the dry cleaner where Mrs. Huang had taken in his suit and asked him about somebody important, past the coffee place he didn't stop at often enough, through the intersection where the light had been broken for 3 weeks the previous winter, and somehow still made the traffic work. He opened the shop. He stood in it for a moment in the morning quiet before he turned any of the lights on, just standing in it, the smell of it, the familiar specific weight of the air. He'd been in this space for 9 years. He'd built something in here that was actually his, not inherited, not borrowed, just the accumulated result of 9 years of showing up and doing the work even when the work was discouraging and the margins were thin and the roof leaked and the fluorescent tube buzzed. He turned the lights on. He went to the workbench and picked up where he'd left off on a 1969 BSA he'd had for 6 weeks. Slower work than the Norton, more uncertain provenance, requiring more judgment calls in the places where the documentation ran out. He worked for 2 hours in the Saturday quiet, the radio on low, a cup of coffee going cold on the corner of the bench the way it always did. At 10 o'clock, Victoria arrived with Emma. This had become a thing that happened on some Saturdays. Not planned, not scheduled, just the way some things become the shape of a life without being formally decided. Victoria would bring Emma over after the weekly farmers market. Emma had recently developed a strong opinion about attending, and Emma would sit in the client chair near the door and read or draw or hold a conversation with whoever happened to come in, and Victoria would find a spot at the end of the workbench and work on her own things, and Logan would keep working on whatever he was working on, and the shop would be occupied by the specific texture of 3 people who knew how to be in a room together. Emma came in first. "We got bread," she announced, holding up a paper bag. "And some cheese that Victoria said was good, but I don't know." "It is good," Victoria said, coming in behind her. "It's aged cheddar." "It smells weird." Aged things often smell weird. That's part of the value proposition. Emma set the bread on the workbench and looked at the BSA with the appraising eye she'd developed for motorcycles in 18 months of Saturday visits. "What's wrong with this one?" "The carburetor's been rebuilt wrong twice by someone who didn't know what they were doing. I'm correcting it." She nodded. She pulled the client chair over to a better position and settled into it with the book she'd been carrying and opened it to the middle, where she'd left off. Victoria set her laptop bag on the end of the workbench and took off her jacket and looked at Logan. "How long on the carburetor?" "Another hour, probably." "Okay." She opened the laptop, then she stopped and looked up. "Emma, did you eat breakfast?" "I had the sample crackers at the market." "That's not breakfast." "They gave me a lot." "Logan, there's peanut butter in the cabinet in the back," he said, not looking up from the BSA. "And the end of a loaf of bread." "Sample crackers are a food group," Emma said. "They are not," Victoria said, and went to make Emma actual food, which Emma accepted with the mild tolerance of a child who has learned that some battles are not worth fighting. Logan kept working on the carburetor. From the back room came the sound of a cabinet opening, a knife on bread, Victoria and Emma talking about something in the low registers of an ordinary conversation. He could not hear what they were saying. He didn't need to. There's a thing about people who have been alone for a long time. Not lonely exactly, but alone in the operational sense, carrying their own weight without distribution. That doesn't show up in the good times. It shows up in the quiet ones. In the Tuesday evenings and the Saturday mornings and the ordinary hours that don't have any occasion to them, any event or milestone to point to. Those are the hours that reveal whether something is real or whether it was only performing reality when there was a reason to perform. Logan had been alone in that way for 2 years. He'd built good things in those 2 years. His daughter, his shop, a life with honest dimensions, without inflation or pretense. He'd done it without much help, and he'd gotten used to that, which is one of the ways the human animal protects itself, by adapting to constraint until the constraint feels like freedom. Victoria had been alone in that way for longer than 2 years, since her father got sick probably, or since the relationship that ended because she was never present even when she was in the room. She'd built good things in that alone time too. The company, the leadership, the capacity to navigate rooms full of people trying to diminish her, and come out the other side still standing. Neither of them had been looking for what they found. This is, in Logan's experience, how the real things arrive. Not announced, not strategized, not arrived at through a sequence of logical decisions. They arrive through a rainy parking lot, through a kid's drawing on a wall, through the temperature of someone's hand in yours at a gala, where you're both pretending to be something other than what you are and still managing to tell each other the truth. You can't plan for the real things. You can only recognize them when they arrive, and then have the courage not to walk away from them because they're complicated. Sus. On an evening in late April, Logan was locking up the shop after the last customer of the day had left. He was pulling the bay door down when he heard a car in the lot. He turned around. Victoria's dark blue car. She got out and walked toward him, and she was still in her work clothes, the good ones, the board meeting version of herself, which meant she'd come from the office, which was a 12-minute drive from the shop. She had no reason to be at the shop on a Monday evening. She hadn't texted. "Everything okay?" he said. "Yes." She stopped a few feet from him. She had a look on her face that he recognized as the look from the hallway outside the boardroom. The not composed one, the real one. "I had a moment today." "What kind of moment?" "I was in a meeting about the Q2 projections, and Patterson asked me something about succession planning, routine, nothing alarming. And I answered it correctly and professionally, and then I drove here." She paused. "I wanted to see the shop." "You've seen the shop." "I wanted to see it today." She looked past him at the building. The sign above the door, the lights still on in the bay, the parking lot where she'd stood in the rain the first night, and he'd watched her try to decide whether to leave. "I've been thinking about what you said, about not rushing the thing you're building." He waited. "I think—" She stopped, started again. "I think I've been waiting for the thing between us to resolve into something I can categorize, to become a defined structure with clear terms. Because that's how I've always navigated things that mattered." She met his eyes. "It's not going to do that, is it?" "No," he said. "It's going to keep being what it is, which is people figuring it out as they go." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I'm all right with that. I wanted you to know I'm all right with that." He looked at her. This woman who had walked into his garage in the rain asking for help and had changed the entire shape of the year, who was imperfect and driven and learning, slowly, how to be in a room with people she trusted. And he felt the thing he'd been feeling since October settle finally into something that had a name. He reached into his jacket pocket. He'd been carrying it for 3 weeks, not waiting for a specific moment. There was no planned speech, no orchestrated setting, no version of this that he'd worked out in advance. He'd bought it because he'd been walking past a jewelry store in town and had seen it in the window and had known, without complication, that it was right. A different ring from the first one. Still white gold, still simple, but different. A braided band with a small diamond, not showy, not trying to announce itself, just precise and honest. He held it out. Victoria looked at it. She looked at him. "Logan, this is not the contract," he said. "The contract's done. This is the other thing." She was very still. "I know you don't know how to do this," he said. "I'm not asking you to have it figured out. I'm asking you to keep showing up." He paused. "You already are. I'm just asking you to do it officially." She looked at the ring for a long moment. He watched her face move through something. Not performed emotion, the real kind. The kind that comes up from underneath before you can decide what to do with it. "Emma, see," she said. "I talked to Emma." Her eyes came up. "You talked to Emma before you talked to me?" "Emma is a stakeholder." A sound came out of her that was genuinely a laugh, startled and real, the kind that bypasses all the management. "What did she say?" "She said yes, and then she said she wanted a dog." Victoria pressed her hand over her mouth for a second. Then she lowered it. Her eyes were bright again, the way they'd been in the shop a few months ago, and this time she didn't hold it. "What did you say about the dog?" she said. "I said probably." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She looked at the shop. The sign he'd repainted last fall, the bay door he'd fixed over the winter, the window where the light came through at the right angle on Saturday mornings when they were all inside together. The ordinary building that had been the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for. She held out her left hand. He put the ring on. It fit the way the first one had. Close enough not to slide, not so tight it pulled. He wondered briefly if she'd given him the measurement at some point, or if he'd simply known, and then he thought that after 9 months of paying attention to a person, maybe those two things were the same. She looked at her hand. She looked at him. "I don't have a speech," she said. "I don't need one." "I know. I'm just noting that I'm the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and I am completely without words." "Yeah," he said. "I know." She stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in the parking lot where she'd stood in the rain on the first night, the April evening going soft around them, the lot quiet, the shop sign lit above the door. After a while, she said, against his jacket, "I'm going to mess up sometimes. I know. I'm going to work too much, and I'm going to go into strategy mode when I should just be a person. I know that too. You're going to have to tell me when I'm doing it." "I will." He paused. "You're going to have to tell me when I've used up my word count for the day." She made a sound against his jacket. "You do have a word count." "I really do. Emma told me. She said sometimes you just need to sit near you without talking." A pause. "I'm getting better at that." "You are," he said. "You're actually pretty good at it now." She was quiet for a moment. The evening was doing the thing April evenings do when the year is turning back toward warmth. The air still cool, but the quality of it changed. Something returned. He could smell the shop behind them, and the lot, and the faint distant smell of someone nearby cooking dinner. "Logan," she said. "Yeah." "I'm glad I walked into your garage." He looked up at the sign. Mercer's Cycles. The paint he'd touched up last fall, the letters he'd straightened, the place he'd built 9 years ago that had been many things, refuge and burden and occupation and proof of concept, and that had become, in one rainy October evening, the place where something else started. "Yeah," he said. "So am I." What Logan would tell you if you asked, and he's the kind of man who doesn't volunteer it but answers honestly when asked, is that the things that cost you the most are usually the things that make the most sense in retrospect. The debt, the divorce, the fake engagement that wasn't fake in any of the ways that counted. The 4 hours in October when the world contracted to a warehouse on Route 9 and the only thing that mattered was getting his daughter back. He'd say, "You don't get to choose the form the important things arrive in. You only get to choose whether you open the door." He opened the door. What Victoria would tell you is that she spent a long time believing that competence was the same thing as strength, that if she could just execute well enough, plan carefully enough, stay ahead of every variable, she could run her life the way she ran a company, efficiently, strategically, on her own terms. She'd been good at it, and it had cost her, quietly, everything it could reach. She'd say, strategy is for problems. The things that actually matter aren't problems, they're just people, and people don't respond to strategy. They respond to presence, to showing up, to sitting in a motorcycle shop on a Saturday morning and being in the same room without needing to manage it into something. Emma would tell you, if you caught her at the right moment between the horse drawings and the bridge drawings and the mountain drawings and the new series she'd started of things she could see from windows, that adults make everything harder than it needs to be. That it's pretty simple, actually. You talk to a plant, you show up, you remember small things about people. She'd tell you that she got the dog, eventually. A mixed breed named Norton, because Emma had been listening when Logan talked about the motorcycle, and Emma is the kind of kid who pays attention. The house is louder now than it used to be on Tuesday evenings. It's louder in the mornings, and on weekends, and at dinner. It's louder in the way a house gets when it has stopped being quiet on purpose, when the quiet that's left is the kind you choose rather than the kind that just happens to you. Logan doesn't lie awake on Tuesday nights anymore, listening to the silence get loud. He has other things to listen to now. And for the first time since the year everything fell apart, the house at the end of the day, with its stack of Emma's drawings and its aging refrigerator, and the dog who has claimed the good chair, and the woman who works too much but comes home, sounds exactly like what it is. Which is enough. Which is, if you sit with it long enough, everything.